Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I lived alone in a cabin up in the northern Idaho mountains for 5 years. 5 good years. I wasn't running from anything. I just liked the quiet. The cabin was my own. I built most of it myself, tucked back in a stand of pine and fir, about a half-mile from the nearest logging road. It was a simple life. I had a wood stove, a well I'd dug, a garden in the summer, and a root cellar. I'd go into town maybe once a month for supplies I couldn't make or grow myself, and that was it. I liked the silence. I liked being the only person for miles. At least I thought I was. The weird stuff started small, maybe a year before everything went bad. I'd leave a wrench on the stump I used as a workbench, and the next morning it had be gone. I'd blame myself, figure I'd just misplaced it, but it happened with other things too. A good hunting knife, a coil of rope, just little things, annoying but not scary. Then the animal remains started showing up. Not just a pile of bones left by a wolf or a cougar. This was different. I remember the first time I saw one. It was a rabbit, but it was hung up in the low branches of a young pine tree, maybe 6 feet off the ground. Its head was gone, and its insides were pulled out and draped over a branch like some kind of sick decoration. I figured it was a bird of prey, maybe an eagle that got spooked and dropped it. It was strange. But nature is strange. I didn't think much more about it, but it kept happening. A fox, its spine snapped, wedged high up in the crook of 2 branches. A young deer, same thing, hooves pointing at the sky. It was always placed, not just dropped. And the smell, it was a thick, coppery, rotten smell that would hang in the air for days. I started getting a bad feeling, a low-grade dread that was always there in the back of my mind. I started carrying my rifle with me whenever I went more than 50 feet from the cabin, even just to the outhouse. Then came the January storm. This wasn't your average winter blow. This was the kind of storm they talk about for years. The snow started the previous afternoon, just light flurries, but by nightfall, the wind was howling like a living thing, screaming through the pines and shaking the cabin walls. I stayed up late, stoking the wood stove, listening to the world outside turn white and furious. I finally fell asleep in my chair, the fire crackling, feeling pretty secure in my little fortress. I woke up to a silence so deep it was louder than the storm had been. The wind had stopped. The only light was a dull grey coming through the windows, which were completely plastered with snow. I pulled on my boots and my heavy coat and pushed the front door. It didn't budge. I had to put my shoulder into it, and when it finally gave way, a wall of snow collapsed into the room. It was waist deep, maybe deeper in the drifts. The world was just gone, replaced by a perfect, unbroken blanket of white. The trees were bent double, their branches looking like tired old men under the weight. My first thought was the shed. My generator was in there, my gas cans, my chainsaw, most of my tools, and a good portion of my smoked meat for the winter. If the roof collapsed under all that snow, I'd be in a world of hurt. I had to get to it and clear the roof. It took me almost an hour to shovel a path just 20 yards to the shed. The snow was heavy and wet, the kind that packs like concrete. My lungs burned with every breath of the freezing air. I was sweating under my layers, a bad sign, but I had to keep going. That's when I saw it. There was a tall, lone pine about 30 feet from the shed. Something was hanging from one of its upper branches, something dark and heavy. At first, I thought it was just a weird clump of snow. I kept shoveling, my focus on the path, but my eyes kept drifting back to it. It was too symmetrical, too deliberate. I stopped shoveling and just stood there, my breath pluming in the still air, and really looked. It was a deer, a full-grown buck, It was hanging upside down by one back leg, which was wrapped and tangled in the branch. Its other three legs were dangling limp. Its belly was torn wide open, a huge ragged hole from its ribs down, but it was empty. No guts, no organs, just a hollow cavity, caked with frozen blood and a dusting of new snow. The smell was faint in the cold, but it was there, that same metallic, rotten stench. My stomach turned. This wasn't a predator's work. A wolf or a cat brings its kill down. It doesn't hoist it 15 feet into a tree and empty it like a grocery bag. My heart started thumping a little harder, a dull, anxious rhythm in my chest. That's when I looked down at the snow around the base of the tree, the tracks. I'd seen every kind of track you can imagine in these woods. Bear, cougar, wolf, elk, deer. These were none of those. They were huge, I mean just massive. They were footprints, but they were so wide and so deep, sunk a good foot into the packed snow. They were shaped vaguely like a human foot, but longer, and the toes. They weren't distinct. It was more like a single broad impression with dents where the toes would be. And the stride, the distance between each print was enormous. It would have taken me 3 of my own steps to match the gap between 2 of them. My hands, inside my thick leather gloves, started to shake. This wasn't right. None of this was right. The silence of the woods, which I usually loved, felt heavy and watchful. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was being stared at from 1,000 different hiding places at once. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave the deer there. The thought of it swinging in the wind, that empty belly pointed at my cabin, made me feel sick. I had to get it down. I went back to the cabin, my legs feeling weak and unsteady, and got a long coil of rope and a hatchet. It was a gruesome job. I had to climb partway up the tree, the bark scraping against my coat, my boots slipping on the icy branches. The cold bit into my exposed face. I looped the rope around the deer's free leg, and then around the trunk. I sawed at the tangled leg with the hatchet, the sound of the blade hitting bone making my teeth ache. Finally it gave way, and the carcass dropped, jerking hard against the rope. I lowered it down, the dead weight of it feeling obscene. I dragged it through the snow to the shed. I didn't want it near the cabin, I just wanted it out of sight. I shoved it into a corner of the shed, covering it with an old tarp. My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely get the shed door closed and latched. I hurried back down the path to the cabin, not looking back, feeling a desperate need to get behind a locked door. I got inside, bolted the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. I took off my wet coat and boots and went to the window, the one that faced the shed and the tree line. I wiped the condensation from the glass with my sleeve and just stared out, my heart still hammering. That's when I saw it. Movement along the edge of the trees, maybe 100 yards out, something big and dark, moving upright. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk like that. They hunch, they amble. This thing moved with a purpose, a powerful fluid stride that carried it through the deep snow like it was nothing. It was covered in thick, dark brown hair, matted and shaggy. It was huge. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be at least 1.5 feet taller and twice as broad in the shoulders. It stopped near my shed. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen, my face pressed to the cold glass. It stood there for a moment, its head turning slowly, and then it took a step toward the shed. It didn't even try the latch. It just swung its arm. It was a long, powerful limb, and it moved so fast, I barely registered it. There was a loud, sharp crack that echoed in the silent clearing, and the shed door, a solid piece of 2-inch thick wood I'd built myself, just splintered. Pieces of wood flew inward. Then it made a sound. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a roar like a bear. It was deeper than that. Lower. It came from its chest, a deep, guttural, rumbling bellow that seemed to vibrate right through the cabin walls and into my own ribs. It was a sound of pure, raw power, and it chilled me in a way the freezing temperature never could. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world. The creature reached into the shed and pulled out the deer carcass, the tarp falling away. It slung the dead animal over its shoulder as easily as I'd carry a backpack. Then it turned, its head swung around, and its eyes found the cabin window. Found me. They weren't animal eyes. They weren't the flat black eyes of a bear. They were set deep under a heavy brow, but they were a dark, intelligent brown, and they held a spark of something knowing. They looked almost human, but ancient and utterly wild. There was no anger in them, no malice, just a cold, penetrating awareness. It saw me, it knew I was there, it knew I was watching. It stood there for what felt like an hour, just looking at me. I was paralyzed, my blood turned to ice. Then it turned, and in two of those massive ground-eating strides, it disappeared back into the deep shadows of the pines, the deer carcass bouncing on its shoulder. I slid down the wall onto the floor, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I was gasping for air. I'd never been so terrified in my entire life. That wasn't an animal. That was something else. The rest of the day was a blur of fear. I checked and rechecked the door locks. I loaded my rifle and leaned it against the wall next to my chair. I tried to eat something but couldn't. Every little creak of the cabin settling, every gust of wind that rattled a window pane, made me jump. Night fell early, the darkness absolute and heavy. I had a single oil lamp lit, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. I was sitting in my chair, the rifle across my lap, staring into the fire in the wood stove, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That's when the noise started, a heavy thump against the side of the cabin near the front. Then another. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic. Thump, 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 like something big was pacing out there. I stood up, the rifle gripped so tight my knuckles were white. I crept to the front window, staying to the side, and peered out into the blackness. I couldn't see anything. The thumping stopped. The silence was worse. Then, all at once, there was a tremendous crash. The front window, the same one I'd been looking out of that morning, exploded inward. A thick, gnarled branch, as big around as my forearm, came flying into the room, followed by a shower of glass and a blast of freezing air. A roar, that same awful chest-deep roar, filled the cabin, so loud it felt like it was inside my head. I didn't think. I just screamed and fired the rifle. I fired it twice, blindly, through the shattered window frame into the darkness. The shots were deafening in the small space. The roaring stopped. I scrambled away from the window, grabbing a heavy wool blanket and shoving it into the broken frame to block the wind and whatever was out there. I dragged my kitchen table over and barricaded the door with it and a chair. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner farthest from the door and windows, the rifle pointed at the broken window, listening. I didn't sleep a wink. I just sat there, shaking, waiting for the door to be torn from its hinges. Nothing else happened that night. The sun eventually came up, casting a weak grey light into the cabin, illuminating the glittering shards of glass all over my floor and the huge stick lying in the middle of the room. I stayed barricaded in for most of the next day. But by late afternoon, I was running low on firewood. The cold was starting to seep back in. I had a small stack on the porch just outside the door. I had to risk it. I moved the barricade slowly, my ears straining for any sound. I cracked the door open, the rifle held ready. The clearing was empty. The snow was a mess of tracks, most of them my own from the day before. But there, leading away from the broken window, were those same huge, wide prints. I took a deep breath and stepped out, my eyes darting everywhere. I started grabbing logs from the pile, my movements quick and jerky. I was stuffing the last two into the crook of my arm when I heard it. A sharp, groaning crack. I looked up. A large pine tree, about 40 yards away at the edge of the clearing, was tilting. It wasn't falling slowly, it was being pushed. With a final splintering roar, it crashed down into the clearing, sending up a huge plume of snow. And there it was, standing right where the tree had been. It was closer than it had been the day before, close enough that I could see details I'd missed. Its hair wasn't just brown, it was a mix of dark brown and black, and it was tangled with frost and bits of twig and ice. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, sloping down to long, powerful arms. Its hands, they were flexing, the fingers opening and closing. They were huge, with thick, grimy nails. Its chest was broad and deep, rising and falling with its breath, which came out in thick white plumes in the cold air. It just stood there, looking at me, its dark eyes locked onto mine. There was no expression on its face, but its whole body was a promise of strength, of a power so absolute it could snap that tree or me without a second thought. That feeling of dread turned into pure, unadulterated terror. It was a physical force that emptied my lungs and turned my legs to water. I dropped the firewood. I didn't even think about raising the rifle. There was no fight in me, only flight. I scrambled back through the door, slamming it shut and throwing my weight against it as I fumbled with the bolt. I didn't look out the window again. I just slid down to the floor, my entire body convulsing with sobs of pure fear. I knew, with a certainty that was colder than the January air, that I was not the top of the food chain out here, not even close. It took 3 more days for the rangers to get through the snow to check on me. I must have looked like a madman. I told them everything, my story tumbling out in a frantic, broken mess. The lead ranger, an older guy with a calm face, just listened. When I finished, he didn't laugh. He didn't tell me I was crazy. He just nodded slowly and said, "You're not the first this winter. We've had a few other reports from trappers and folks way out in the backcountry describing the same thing, the tracks, the sounds." I didn't stay another night. I packed a single bag, left almost everything I owned in that cabin, and got in the ranger's truck. I never went back. I sold the place, the land, everything, for a fraction of what it was worth. I didn't care. I live in a small apartment in town now. I sleep with the lights on sometimes, and I still see it clear as day. Not the size of it or the power it showed when it smashed my shed. I see the way it moved through the snow with that effortless, powerful stride. And I hear it. Not the roar that shattered my window, but that first, deep, guttural bellow that carried through the storm and told me, in a language older than words, that I was not alone and I was not safe. I don't know what it was. I don't think I ever want to know. I just know it was there. Story 2. It was the summer of 1993, and I was living on 5 acres in the Cascade Mountains, right in Skamania County, Washington. The place was remote, surrounded by dense woods that felt ancient and untouched. I'd bought the land a few years back, wanting to get away from the city noise and raise my daughter somewhere she could run free. That evening, like most evenings, we were outside as the sun started to dip behind the peaks. The air was cooling down, and the light had that golden haze that makes everything look soft and dreamy. My daughter was maybe 7 or 8 at the time. I don't remember exactly, but she was full of energy, chasing after our dog, a big grey wolf mix we'd had since he was a pup. He was more wolf than dog, with a thick coat and eyes that seemed to see right through you, but he was gentle as could be with her. We were playing fetch with a beat-up tennis ball, laughing as the dog would sprint after it and bring it back, his tail wagging like crazy. The woods around us were alive with the usual sounds, birds chirping, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of insects. It felt peaceful, like nothing could ever go wrong out here. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have this slice of paradise, even if it meant dealing with the occasional bear or coyote. But that night, everything changed in a way I still can't fully wrap my head around. It started with the neighbors' dogs. They lived about a half-mile down the road, and their dogs were usually quiet, just a bark or two if a car passed by. But this time, their barking was different, sharp and frantic, like they were scared out of their minds. I paused, listening, and my daughter stopped too, her smile fading. The dog, he perked up his ears, his body going stiff. Then, out of nowhere, this sound cut through the air. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. I'd heard those before, and this was nothing like it. It was a deep, guttural growl that rolled into a howling scream, something so loud and raw it felt like it vibrated in my chest. I'd never heard anything like it, not in all my years living out here. It was primal, like something out of a nightmare, and it made the hair on my arms stand straight up. For a second, everything just stopped. The birds went silent, the insects quit buzzing, and even the wind seemed to die down. The canyon fell dead quiet, like someone had flipped a switch. Then this smell hit me. A horrible, thick stench of something dead mixed with a heavy musk, like wet fur and rot. It was so strong it made my eyes water, and I could taste it in the back of my throat. My dog, who'd never been afraid of anything, let out a low whine and bolted for the house. He squeezed under the porch where there was a gap just big enough for him, and he wouldn't come out no matter how much I called. I was shouting his name, my voice shaky, but he just cowered there, his eyes wide with fear. That's when I knew something was really wrong. This dog had faced down bears without flinching, but whatever was out there had him terrified. I grabbed my daughter's hand, it was cold and small in mine, and told her to get inside now. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, and my hands were trembling. I didn't want to scare her, but I couldn't hide the urgency in my voice. She didn't ask questions, just nodded and ran for the door. I followed her, my eyes scanning the tree line. The woods were darkening fast, shadows stretching across the ground. And that's when I heard it, a series of crashing sounds, like something big was moving through the underbrush. Not the light rustle of a deer or the clumsy stumble of a bear, but heavy, deliberate steps that snapped branches and shook the bushes. It was close, maybe 100 yards away. And it was getting closer. I got us inside and locked the door, my breath coming in short gasps. The house felt small and fragile suddenly, like it wouldn't offer much protection. I peered out the window, but it was too dark to see much beyond the yard. The silence was eerie, broken only by those occasional crashes from the woods. Each one made me jump, and I could feel the sweat cooling on my skin. My daughter huddled next to me on the couch, her face pale, and I put an arm around her, trying to act calm even though I was shaking inside. I kept thinking about what it could be. A bear? No, bears don't move like that, and they don't smell that bad. A moose? We don't have moose around here. My mind kept circling back to the stories I'd heard from other locals, whispers about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I'd always brushed them off as tall tales, but now, with that scream and the smell and the way my dog reacted, it was hard to dismiss. The night dragged on, and it was the quietest I'd ever experienced. Normally, you'd hear owls or coyotes, but there was nothing, just this heavy silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Every now and then, there'd be another wood-breaking noise like a tree limb snapping, and I'd tense up, waiting for something to happen. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the window with a flashlight and a rifle, though I don't know what good it would have done. My daughter eventually fell asleep on the couch, but I stayed awake, listening. The smells lingered too, coming in waves through the cracks in the windows, making my stomach churn. As the hours passed, I became more and more convinced that it was a Bigfoot. It wasn't just a guess, it felt like a certainty. Deep in my bones, the way it moved, the sounds it made, the sheer size of whatever was out there. It all added up. I thought about how the neighbors' dogs had reacted, how the silence had fallen so abruptly, and how my own dog, a creature that was part wild himself, had been reduced to a trembling mess. That wasn't normal animal behavior. Whatever it wasn't something I could explain away. When morning finally came, the sun rose like nothing had happened. The birds started singing again, and the woods looked peaceful. I ventured outside, my legs weak, and called for the dog. He came out slowly, his tail between his legs, and he stayed close to me for days after that. I walked the perimeter of the property, looking for signs, tracks, broken branches, anything, but the ground was dry and rocky, and I didn't find much. Just a few crushed bushes and a lingering hint of that awful smell near the tree line. I never saw what it was, and I'm glad I didn't. But that experience has stayed with me for over 30 years now. I've told a few people about it, but most just shrug it off or laugh. They weren't there though. They didn't hear that scream or smell that stench or feel that paralyzing fear. I still live out here, but I'm more cautious now, especially at dusk. And sometimes on quiet nights, I'll catch a whiff of something musky on the wind, and my heart will skip a beat. I don't know what it was that night, and I probably never will. But I know it was real, and I know it was something beyond anything I'd ever encountered before. Story 3. Okay, I'm just going to type this out. I've never written it all down before, and I'm not doing this for clicks or whatever. I just need to get it out of my head, and maybe typing it here where people might actually believe me will help. My hands are still a little shaky thinking about it, even now. This was back in late September. I remember because the air had that real sharp bite to it, the kind that tells you summer's well and truly dead, and winter's just waiting to pounce. Me and Steve, he was my partner on this job, were working up at this old mining camp near Cracker Creek, way up in the mountains at like 8,000 feet. Our job was to reopen some of the old gold mine tunnels, see if there was anything left worth pulling out of the rock. It wasn't a glamorous gig. It was cold, it was lonely, and the silence up there was a heavy thing, like a weight on your chest. The days were getting shorter, and the sun would dip behind the peaks early, throwing the whole valley into a deep, blue shadow long before it was actually night. We were staying in this little prefab trailer that the company had dropped off. It had a propane heater that groaned all night and 2 cots that felt like they were stuffed with rocks. We'd spend our days in the mines, the beam of our headlamps cutting through the absolute black, the only sounds being our picks hitting rock and our own breathing. It was a weird kind of isolation. You'd go hours without saying a word to each other, just 2 guys alone with their thoughts in the dark. Anyway, this one particular evening, the sun was just starting to go down, painting the sky in these weak oranges and purples. Steve needed to make a phone call to his wife, I think. We had no service at the camp itself, 0 bars, but we'd found a spot, an upper switchback on the old logging road that wound its way above us, where you could sometimes get a single flickering bar if you held your phone just right. So I fired up the ATV. It was this old beat-up 4-wheeler, green paint scratched to hell, and it always smelled like gas and hot oil. Steve climbed on the back, and we started puttering up the rough, rocky track. The engine was loud, a noisy little buzzsaw tearing through the quiet. I remember the cold air whipping past my face, making my eyes water. I was just wearing a flannel shirt and a jacket, and I was already feeling the chill deep in my bones. We got to the switchback, a flattish area carved out of the mountainside. Below us, you could see the dark green blanket of the forest falling away into deep shadows. Steve hopped off, phone already in his hand, holding it up to the sky like an offering. He started pacing around, trying to find that sweet spot. "Gonna try over there," he said, pointing with his chin towards the edge of the clearing. "You mind?" "Nah, go ahead," I told him. I figured I'd give him some privacy. It felt like the decent thing to do, so I started walking a little ways uphill from him, away from the ATV, just to kill time. I found a decent-sized boulder and leaned against it, looking out into the trees. That's when the quiet really hit me. The ATV engine had been so loud, and when I shut it off, the silence that rushed in to fill the space was immense. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, it was a dead quiet, a heavy, waiting kind of quiet. It's hard to explain, but you know how normally in the woods, even when it's silent, there's something, a bird, a squirrel chattering, the wind in the pine needles. There was nothing. Absolute zero. It was like someone had thrown a soundproof blanket over the whole mountain. I remember feeling a little prickle on the back of my neck, just a stupid, superstitious feeling, but I shrugged it off. I figured the animals were just bedding down for the night. I stood there for a few minutes, listening to the nothing, watching the light fade from the sky. The trees turned from green to black, their details getting swallowed by the gloom. I could just barely hear the low murmur of Steve's voice behind me, talking to his wife. It was a comfort, that little thread of normalcy. And then it happened. It didn't start as a sound you hear with your ears. It started in my feet. A low, deep vibration came up through the soles of my boots, a resonant thrum that traveled right up my legs into my gut. A split second later, the sound hit my ears. It was a growl, but that word doesn't do it justice. It wasn't a dog's growl or a bear's growl. This was deeper, heavier, like the sound of a big diesel engine turning over on a cold morning. But alive, it was a guttural, chesty roar that seemed to come from a cluster of thick brush and scraggly pines about 30, maybe 40 yards to my left, downhill a bit. The sound didn't just stop. It hung in the air, this physical pressure, and I felt it in my teeth. My heart, which had been beating slow and bored, just exploded in my chest. Bam! Like a kick. Every hair on my arms and on the back of my neck stood straight up. My mouth went completely dry, cotton dry. This wasn't just being startled. This was a primal, gut-level terror. My brain was screaming one word: predator. My body moved before my mind did. My right hand went to my hip, fumbling with the strap on my holster. I carry a 1911, a 45. It's a heavy, solid piece of steel, and it usually makes me feel secure. In that moment, pulling it out, it felt like a toy. My fingers were numb and clumsy, but I got the strap undone and wrapped my hand around the grip. The cold, checkered metal was a tiny anchor to reality. I thumbed the safety off, the click sounding impossibly loud in the silence that had followed the growl. I raised the pistol, holding it in a two-handed grip, pointing it in the general direction of the brush. My arms were trembling. I was trying to peer into the shadows between the trees, but the light was failing fast. Everything was just shapes of black and darker black. My eyes were straining, trying to pick out a form, a movement, anything. And then I smelled it. A smell hit my nostrils, cutting through the clean, piney scent of the mountain air. It was a thick, musky odor, like wet dog, but older, like damp earth and rotten leaves and something else. Something wild and animal that I'd never smelled before. It was pungent and strong, and it made the back of my throat feel thick. I was frozen there, gun pointed, heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack one. I could hear Steve behind me. He'd stopped talking. I could feel his silence. He'd heard it too. Then, movement. It wasn't a slow reveal. It was a flash, a burst of motion from the tree line. Something huge broke from the shadows and ran across the open slope below me. It was moving from my left to my right, heading towards that same cluster of brush where the growl had come from. My brain tried to process what I was seeing and just short-circuited. It was on two legs. Bipedal. That was the first, most shocking thing. It wasn't a bear. Bears run on all fours when they're moving fast. This thing was running upright, with a powerful, fluid stride that was terrifying in its efficiency. It was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be over 7 feet easy. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, like a power lifter's, and they tapered down to a narrower waist. It was covered in hair, long, shaggy hair that was a dark, muddy brown, but with a reddish tint to it where the last of the fading light caught it. Its head was heavy and kind of sunk down between its shoulders, like it didn't have much of a neck at all. Its arms were long, and they swung as it ran, powerful looking, hanging low. The speed was what sealed the deal for me. It covered the ground in a way that didn't seem possible for something that size. The distance it crossed was about 30 yards, the length of a baseball infield. It covered it in a few seconds, 2-3 seconds max. It wasn't a frantic, scrambling run. It was an effortless, ground-eating lope. It moved with a raw, powerful grace that was completely alien. It passed maybe 50 feet in front of me. Close enough. As it ran, I heard it breathing, not panting, not gasping for air. It was a steady, rhythmic sound, a deep huff, huff, huff. Like a bellows, a sound of immense power being expended without any strain at all. That sound, more than anything else, drilled into me. This wasn't an animal at its limit. This was an animal moving comfortably. Then it reached the thick cluster of brush and trees, and it was just gone. It didn't crash through the branches. It didn't make a sound. 1 second it was this colossal, terrifying figure moving across the mountain, and the next second the forest had just swallowed it whole. The silence rushed back in, even heavier than before. I don't know how long I stood there, gun still raised, pointing at nothing. My muscles were locked. I couldn't move. I could still smell that musky, earthy odor hanging in the air. I could still feel the vibration of that growl in my bones. I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. Fast footsteps. I flinched, whipping my head around, my finger tightening on the trigger. It was Steve. His face was pale, his eyes wide and white in the twilight. He was staring at me, then past me at the empty slope. "You saw that," he whispered. "It wasn't a question." I just nodded. My voice was gone. I managed to lower my gun, my arms aching from the tension. "We need to go," he said, his voice tight. "Right now." I didn't need to be told twice. We both scrambled for the ATV. I fumbled with the key, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get it in the ignition. Steve practically jumped onto the back, his hands gripping my shoulders. I turned the key and the engine sputtered to life. The sound was a welcome, human noise. I didn't bother with the headlight. I just gunned it, sending a spray of gravel behind us as I swung the ATV around and pointed it back down the mountain. I drove like a man possessed, taking the rough, winding road way too fast, the ATV bouncing and skidding. Neither of us spoke. We just held on, the cold wind screaming past us. I kept glancing in the little side mirror, half expecting to see that massive dark shape loping behind us, keeping pace, effortlessly. But there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road and the black wall of trees. We didn't stop until we were back at the trailer. I killed the engine, and for a minute we just sat there in the new, profound silence, listening to our own ragged breathing. We got out and went inside without a word. Steve locked the door. I checked it twice. Then I sat down on my cot, the 1911 still in my hand, and I just stared at the wall. That was the day, but it wasn't the end of it. That was just the beginning of knowing. In the weeks that followed, right up until we packed up and left in late October, the feeling never went away. The feeling of being watched. We'd be working, and you'd get that itch between your shoulder blades, the uncanny sense that eyes were on you from the tree line. A couple of times, we'd come out in the morning and find our tools, a shovel, a pick, not where we'd left them. Moved just a few feet, like someone had picked them up, looked at them and set them down again. The worst was the footprints. We found them one morning near the tailings pile, the big mound of waste rock from the mine. They were huge, long, like a man's, but wider, a lot wider, and the stride was immense. I stood where one print was and looked to the next one. I would have had to take a running jump to cover that distance. We just looked at them, then at each other, and then we went back to work without saying a word. We didn't need to. We never saw it again, not directly, but we knew it was there. It was always there. We were just working in its house. We finished our contract, got our last paycheck, and got the hell off that mountain. I never went back. I still think about it, especially on cold, quiet nights. I think about the sound, the smell, the way it moved. I think about the sheer, effortless power of it. I have my 1911 in a lockbox now. Sometimes I take it out, just to hold it, to feel the weight of it in my hand, and I remember how utterly useless it felt. how small it made me feel, standing there on that mountainside, pointing a piece of metal at a shadow that was already gone. Story 4. Okay, so I've been sitting on this for years, and I guess now's as good a time as any to get it out. I'm 36 years old, used to be a Marine, and I've spent more time in the woods than most people ever will. I know how to handle myself out there, how to read the signs, how to stay calm when things get sketchy. But what happened to me back in 1993 in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, on state game land? That was different. That was the first and only time I've ever felt real, bone-deep fear in the wilderness. I'm sharing this because maybe someone out there has heard something similar, or maybe it'll just help me make sense of it. But honestly, I doubt it ever will. It was deer season, late November, and the air was so cold it felt like it was biting into my skin. I remember the sky was this dull gray, the kind that promises snow but hasn't quite delivered yet. The ground was already covered in a thin layer of white from a fall a couple days before, crunching under my boots with every step. My dad and I had driven out before dawn, the truck heater blasting, but not doing much against the chill. He's been hunting since he was a kid, taught me everything I know, and we've always had this routine. That day, we parked near this big meadow off one of the dirt roads that cut through the game land. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get in deep woods early in the morning, with just the sound of the wind rustling the bare branches. We split up around 7 in the morning. My dad wanted to set up in the meadow where he'd seen some tracks earlier, and I decided to go deeper. I told him I'd head about 3/4 of a mile farther into this valley I'd scouted before. The valley was surrounded by these steep hills, all covered in snow, with thick patches of hemlock and oak trees. It was a good spot, secluded, with plenty of deer sign. I had my Winchester .30-30 rifle slung over my shoulder and my Ruger 45 Colt pistol on my hip, both loaded and ready. As a Marine, I'm used to being armed, but out here, it was just part of the hunt. Nothing felt off at first. I started making my way down into the valley, the snow squeaking under my boots. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, casting weak shadows, but it was still dim under the tree canopy. I remember the smell, that crisp, piney scent mixed with the damp earth. I'd been walking for about an hour, moving slow, scanning for movement when I first heard it. It was distant, maybe a few hundred yards away, up on one of the ridges. This deep guttural noise, like a belch but way louder and more primal. I'd heard bears before, and this wasn't that. Bears grunt and growl, but this was different. It was like something from the bottom of its chest, echoing through the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I thought, maybe it's a moose or something, but moose aren't common around there, and this sounded bigger. I stood there for a minute listening, trying to place it. Then it came again, closer this time, way closer, like it had covered a couple hundred yards in just a few seconds. That's when the first chill went down my spine. I've been in combat. I've faced situations where adrenaline takes over, but this was different. This was the unknown. I raised my rifle, finger off the trigger but ready, and scanned the ridge above me. The sound kept coming, not constant, but in bursts, each one closer than the last. It was moving fast, too fast for any animal I knew. Deer don't make noise like that, and bears don't move that quick through thick snow and brush. As it got closer, the sound changed. It wasn't just that belch-like noise anymore. It was like it was vocalizing, but not in any pattern I could make out. Then, as dusk started to settle in, the sky turning this murky purple, the vocalizing stopped, just like that. Silence. But it wasn't quiet for long. That's when I heard the branches breaking. Not little twigs snapping, but big limbs, like something huge was pushing through the trees up on the ridge. Crack, crack, crack. Each one made me flinch. I could feel my hands getting sweaty inside my gloves, and my breathing got shallow. I was standing in this little clearing in the valley, surrounded by hills, and I felt trapped. Like whatever it was, it had me cornered. I remember looking around, trying to see movement, but the trees were too thick. The breaking sounds kept coming back and forth like it was pacing. That's what it felt like. Pacing. Like it was sizing me up or maybe herding me. I've never felt so small in my life. My mind was racing. I thought about all the stories I'd heard growing up, about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but I'd always brushed them off as nonsense. Now, standing there, with this thing above me, I wasn't so sure. The cold was seeping through my layers, but I was shaking more from fear than the temperature. I gripped my rifle tighter, the metal cold against my palm, and I just stood there for what felt like an eternity. Later, I realized it was probably only 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every time a branch snapped, my heart would pound harder. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. I kept thinking, what if it comes down here? What do I do? I had my guns, but the thought of shooting at something I couldn't see, something that sounded that big, made my stomach twist. I'm not a coward. I've faced down threats before, but this was different. This wasn't a person or a known animal. This was something else. The breaking sounds were deliberate, like it was trying to intimidate me, and it worked. I felt this overwhelming urge to get out of there, to run, but I forced myself to stay put, to not make any sudden moves. After those 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly started packing up my gear. I had a small backpack with some supplies, and I decided to head back toward my dad. I didn't want to turn my back on the ridge, so I started walking backward at first, keeping my eyes on the trees above. The breaking sound stopped as soon as I moved. Just like that, silence again. That was almost worse. Now I didn't know where it was or what it was doing. I picked up my pace, my boots slipping a little in the snow, and I headed out of the valley back the way I came. As I moved away, I kept listening, but I didn't hear anything else. No more vocalizing, no breaking branches, nothing. The woods were dead quiet, like everything had frozen. I didn't look back, I just kept going, my heart still hammering in my chest. The walk back felt longer than the walk in, even though it was the same distance. Every shadow made me jump, every rustle of leaves had me reaching for my pistol. I kept expecting to hear that sound again, to feel it closing in on me, but it never came. When I finally reached the meadow where I'd left my dad, the sun was almost down, and the sky was darkening. I saw him standing by the truck, talking with a couple other hunters from our group. They were laughing about something, probably a story one of them had told. I must have looked a mess. Pale, breathing heavy, still clutching my rifle. My dad saw me and smiled, but it faded when he got a closer look. "You okay?" he asked. I just shook my head and told him what happened. I described the noise, the breaking branches, how fast it moved. He listened, but then he kind of chuckled and patted my shoulder. "Probably just a bear, son. Or maybe a falling branch. You know how sound carries out here." The other guys nodded, adding their own theories about wind or animals. They didn't get it. They hadn't been there. I didn't argue. What could I say? I knew what I'd heard, what I'd felt. We packed up and drove home, and I kept my guns close the whole way. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every noise outside had me sitting up in bed listening. Even now, years later, I still think about it. I've been back to those woods a few times since, but I've never gone deep into that valley again. Whatever was on that ridge, it wanted me out, and I got the message. I just wish I knew what it was. Story 5. Okay, I'm just going to type this out. I don't know if anyone will believe me, and honestly, at this point, I don't really care. I just need to get it out of my head. It's been stuck in there, replaying over and over, for what feels like forever now. My hands are still a little shaky just thinking about it. My name's Robert Hatfield. I'm a logger, been one my whole life out of Crescent City. I was down near Fort Bragg for a job, just finished up for the day, and I had to stop by the Jenkins place. Bud and Mary Jenkins are friends of a friend, good people, and they'd offered to put me up for a night since I was in the area. Their house is a bit isolated, about 4 miles out from town proper, tucked back in the redwoods. It's the kind of quiet that really is quiet, you know. Not just the absence of noise, but a deep, thick silence that sits in the air under all those big trees. It was late afternoon, getting on towards evening. I'd say it was about 5:30. The sun was starting to dip, casting long, crazy shadows through the trees, but it was still plenty light out. I'd just gotten my bag from my truck and was heading towards the front door when I heard their dog, a big old German shepherd named Duke, start going absolutely nuts from the backyard. It wasn't his normal, hey, a squirrel bark. This was different. This was a deep, guttural, panicked sound. A something is very wrong bark. The hair on the back of my neck stood up immediately. You spend enough time in the woods, you learn to listen to the animals. They know things. I dropped my bag right there on the porch and went around the side of the house instead of going in. The gate to the chain-link fence around the backyard was around the corner. I remember the gravel crunching under my boots, loud in my ears because Duke's barking was so intense it almost drowned everything else out. I pushed the gate open and stepped into the backyard. Duke was over by the far fence, his body rigid, teeth bared, barking his head off towards the tree line, and then I saw it. At the back of the property, there's a 6-foot-high wooden fence, and standing behind it, looking right over it, was a creature. My brain just froze. It didn't compute. My first stupid thought was, that's one hell of a big bear, but it wasn't. It was standing on 2 legs, straight up, and its chest and shoulders were above the top of that 6-foot fence. I'm 6 feet tall. This thing was looking down on a fence I'd have to jump to see over. It was covered in hair, but it wasn't shaggy like a bear. It was a darker color, like wet earth, a deep brownish black, and it looked thick, almost like a pelt. But the face is what I can't get out of my head. It was flat, and it was hairless, just dark, leathery skin, like old leather, and its eyes, they were perfectly round, not slanted, not like a bear's beady eyes, just 2 big, perfectly round, dark eyes, and they were locked right on me. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, still as a statue, watching us, watching me. Duke's barks turned into this high-pitched whine, and he started backing up, his tail tucked between his legs. The fear that hit me then wasn't like any fear I've ever felt. It wasn't the startled jump you get from a snake on the trail. This was a deep, primal, cold terror that started in my gut and just flooded my whole body. My feet felt glued to the grass. I couldn't breathe. I just stared back at those round, expressionless eyes. Then it moved its head, just a slight tilt, and that broke the spell. I turned and I ran. I didn't think, I just ran. I blasted back through the gate, around the side of the house, and threw the front door open so hard it slammed against the wall inside. Bud and Mary were in the kitchen. I must have looked like a ghost, white as a sheet and breathing in these ragged gasps. "There's something out there," I managed to choke out. "In your backyard. It's huge." Bud, God bless him, is a no-nonsense kind of guy. He just looked at me, saw I wasn't joking, and went to his gun cabinet. He grabbed his rifle, a .30-06, and started loading it. "Show me," he said, his voice calm but tight. Mary was worried, asking what it was, but I couldn't form the words. I just kept saying, "It's not a bear, it's not a bear." The 3 of us went back out the front door. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard, I thought it might crack one. The plan, I guess, was to go around the side of the house and approach the backyard from the same way I had, to get a look without it seeing us first. The side of the house is narrow, with a path between the wall and some overgrown rhododendron bushes. It was shadowy there, the evening light not really reaching. I was in the lead, with Bud right behind me, the rifle held ready. Mary was behind him. We were about halfway down the side of the house when it happened. I turned a slight corner where the path bent, and I walked right into it. I didn't see it. I just felt it. It was like walking into a warm, solid, hairy wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I stumbled back, falling on my ass on the gravel path, and looked up. It was right there. The creature was in the path with us. It must have come around the other side of the house. It was even bigger up close. The smell hit me first. A musky, foul odor, like a wet dog that had been rolling in something dead. Its fur was coarse, and I could see the powerful muscles moving under its shoulders. Its face was only a few feet from mine. Those round black eyes looked down at me, and for a second there was nothing in them. No anger, no curiosity, just nothing. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Then it let out a sound. It wasn't a roar. It was this low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate right through the ground and up into my bones. It didn't come from its throat, it came from its chest. It ignored me. I was on the ground, insignificant. Its focus shifted to Bud and Mary. It took a step, then another, its movements surprisingly fluid for something so massive. It wasn't running, but it was moving fast, with a purpose. Bud shouted something, I don't even remember what, and we all just broke. Pure animal panic. I scrambled to my feet, my boots slipping on the gravel. Bud was trying to back up to get Mary behind him, but the thing was coming right at them. We all scrambled for the front door. It was a blind, terrified rush. I remember the sound of our frantic footsteps and that heavy, quick padding sound right behind us. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it there. I could smell it. I could hear its breathing. Mary got to the door first and flung it open. Bud was right on her heels, yelling at me. I was last. I dove through the doorway, expecting to feel a massive hand grab my leg and yank me back into the twilight. Bud and I spun around and grabbed the door, slamming it shut. It didn't close. It hit something. There was resistance. We threw our shoulders into it, but it wouldn't budge more than an inch. Through the crack, I saw it. A huge, dark, hairy arm was blocking the door. Its hand, a hand with fingers, pressed flat against the outside of the doorframe. It was pushing back. The strength was unbelievable. Bud is a strong man, and I'm not weak, but together we were nothing. We were straining, our feet slipping on the floor, grunting with the effort. But the door was slowly, inexorably being pushed open. That musky smell poured into the house. I could see a sliver of its shoulder, the side of its head. Mary was screaming. It was a high, thin sound of pure terror. Bud's face was purple with strain. His eyes were wide, locked on the door that was steadily opening. He gasped, his voice tight and desperate. I'm going to shoot it. He let go of the door to bring his rifle up. The second he let go, the pressure on the door vanished, just stopped. The door, with just me holding it, slammed shut with a final heavy thud. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, panting, listening. My ears were ringing. Mary was sobbing quietly, her hands over her mouth. We didn't hear anything. No footsteps walking away, no growls, nothing. It was just gone. We stood there for what felt like an hour, maybe it was only 5 minutes, just staring at the door, waiting for it to explode inward. It didn't. Slowly, carefully, Bud moved to the front window and peered out through the edge of the curtain. He looked for a long time. Nothing, he finally whispered. There's nothing out there. It was a long time before any of us could speak properly. We ended up just sitting in the living room in the dark, not turning on any lights, just listening. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the trees outside made us jump. Eventually, when the sun was fully down and we had some courage from the darkness and the solid walls around us, we decided we had to call the sheriff. While we were waiting for them to show up, Bud got his big flashlight and we went back to the front door. I'm not sure why. I think we needed to see, to prove to ourselves it had really happened. We opened the door, the beam of the flashlight cutting a shaky path through the night. The first thing we saw was on the side of the house, right where the path was. On the white siding, about shoulder height for me, was a handprint. It was huge, and it was dirty. like it had been smeared with mud and grime. We measured it later. It was 11 inches from the bottom of the palm to the tip of the middle finger. The fingers were long, thicker than mine. It was a perfect print, pressed into the wood. Then we shined the light down at the ground where I'd fallen, where it had stood. In the soft dirt next to the gravel path, there was a footprint. My blood ran cold all over again. It was a footprint, a human-like footprint, but massive. We measured that too, 16 inches long. You could see the toes, the arch, everything. It was pressed deep into the ground, a testament to the sheer weight of the thing that made it. The sheriff's deputy came. He was polite, took our statements, looked at the prints. He took pictures. He said it was probably a bear. We just looked at him. He hadn't seen its eyes. He hadn't felt its strength. He hadn't smelled its smell. He wrote his report and left, and we were alone again with what we knew. We never saw it again, but we knew. We knew what was out there in those woods. It wasn't a shy, gentle giant from the stories. It was strong, it was fast, and it was aggressive. It chased us. It tried to get into the house. I still work in the woods. I have to. It's my job. But I'm never truly comfortable out there anymore. I'm always watching the tree line, always listening for a silence that's too deep, or a sound that doesn't belong. I carry a bigger gun now, and every time I see a shadow that seems just a little too tall, or hear a branch snap a little too heavily, my heart starts to race, and I'm right back on that gravel path, looking up into those flat, hairless, perfectly round black eyes. I don't know what it was. I just know what it did, and I know that it's real. Story 6. I woke up before sunrise, like always. The air had that bite to it, the kind that seeps into your bones and doesn't let go, even with a fire going. I'd slept under a lean-to I'd slapped together from pine branches and an old canvas tarp, and my breath fogged up in little clouds as I stirred. My joints ached from the damp ground, and I remember rubbing my hands together, trying to get some warmth back into them. Breakfast was just some hardtack and a bit of dried meat, washed down with creek water that was so cold it made my teeth hurt. I didn't bother with coffee. Supplies were running low, and I was saving what I had for when I really needed it. The camp was set up near a creek that fed into the larger rivers where I'd been panning. I had a sluice box I'd built myself, a 20-foot section of wooden troughs and riffles that I used to separate gold from gravel. It was heavy, awkward to move, but it did the job. That morning, I was planning to reposition it further upstream where I'd spotted some promising sediment. The mist was thick, hanging low over the trees, and everything was soaked with dew. I could hear the creek gurgling, and now and then the snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves from animals moving around. Normally, that didn't bother me. You get used to the sounds of the wilderness when you're out there alone. But that day, something felt off right from the start. I'd heard stories from other prospectors and locals about these things they called snowmen, hairy giants that roamed the high slopes. Most folks laughed it off as tall tales, but a few old-timers swore they'd seen them. They described them as ape-like, with long arms that hung down past their knees, short legs and covered in thick matted hair. I never put much stock in it until I started noticing little things myself, like how sometimes I'd find footprints in the mud that were too big to be a bear's, or how supplies would go missing from my camp when I was sure I'd secured them. Nothing major, just enough to make the back of my neck prickle. That morning, as I was gathering my tools, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. It was like someone was watching me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the trees, dripping wet, and the mist swirling in the grey light. I tried to brush it off, told myself I was just spooked from being alone too long, but my heart was beating a little faster than usual, and my hands were clammy despite the cold. I spent the first couple of hours working on the sluice, dragging it through the mud to the new spot. It was hard work, and I was sweating under my layers, even in the chill. The sluice was made of rough-hewn wood, and it weighed a ton. I had to stop every few feet to catch my breath, As I was setting it up, I heard a noise that made me freeze. It wasn't an animal sound, not a bird or a squirrel. It was deeper, like a low grunt or a huff coming from further up the slope. I stood still, listening, but it didn't come again. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet. Even the creek seemed to hushed, like it was holding its breath. I remember my mouth going dry, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my throat. I told myself it was probably a bear. I'd seen plenty of them around, and they usually kept their distance. But bears don't make you feel like this, like your gut is twisting into knots. I decided to ignore it and get back to work. I finished positioning the sluice and started shoveling gravel into it, the rhythm of the work calming me down a bit. The sun was starting to burn through the mist, casting long, shaky shadows through the trees. It should have felt peaceful, but that unease was still there, nagging at me. Around midday, I took a break to eat some more hardtack and drink from the creek. I was sitting on a log, staring into the water when I heard it again. That same low grunt, but closer this time. And then another one, like an answer from a different direction. My head snapped up and I scanned the trees. Nothing, but the hair on my arms was standing up, and I had this cold sweat trickling down my back. I stood slowly, my hand going to the knife I always carried on my belt. It wasn't much against whatever was out there, but it made me feel a little better. I decided to pack up early and head back to camp. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the isolation was getting to me. But as I started gathering my things, I heard a crackling sound from the bushes behind me. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. Movement in the trees about 50 yards away. At first I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But then I realized it was too tall, too lanky. It was one of them, the snowmen the old-timers talked about. My breath caught in my chest, and I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, as it stepped out from behind a pine tree. It was huge, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, shaggy hair that was matted with mud and leaves. Its arms were ridiculously long, hanging down almost to its ankles, and its legs were short and thick, like tree stumps. Its face was partly hidden by hair, but I could see its eyes, dark and intelligent, not like an animal's. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was terrifying because it didn't seem clumsy or wild. It was like it knew exactly what it was doing. It stopped and looked right at me. I felt a jolt of pure fear shoot through me, and my legs turned to jelly. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a few seconds. Then it turned away, like I wasn't worth its attention, and started walking toward my sluice box. I don't know why, but I didn't yell or anything. I just watched, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. The creature reached the sluice, that 20-foot section I'd just spent hours moving, and without any effort, it grabbed one end with both hands. Its hands were massive, with thick fingers that wrapped around the wood like it was nothing. Then, in one swift motion, it lifted the whole thing off the ground. I mean, that sluice was heavy. It had taken me and another guy to set it up originally, and here this thing was hoisting it like it was a twig. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. No man or animal should have that kind of strength. But before I could process it, the creature swung the sluice sideways and smashed it against the trunk of a nearby pine tree. The sound was deafening, a loud crack followed by the splintering of wood. Pieces of the sluice flew everywhere, and the creature let out a roar that echoed through the forest, a deep guttural sound that made my blood run cold. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on my backside. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a second I just lay there, gasping. When I looked up, the creature was still standing there, holding what was left of the sluice, now just a broken mess, and it was looking at me again. Its eyes seemed to gleam with something like curiosity, or maybe anger, I couldn't tell. But in that moment, I knew I was in real danger. This thing could tear me apart without even trying. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't look back, I just ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting away. I could hear it behind me, heavy footsteps and that low grunting, but I didn't dare glance back. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead, but fear kept me going. I made it back to my camp in what felt like seconds, though it must have been longer. I threw my few belongings into my pack, my pan, my shovel, some food, and I didn't even bother to put out the fire. I just grabbed everything and started hiking down the mountain as fast as I could. The whole time I expected to hear it following me, but after a while the sounds faded, and I was alone again with the silence of the forest. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest settlement hours later. My clothes were torn, and I was covered in scratches and mud. When I tried to tell people what happened, some of them laughed, but others got quiet and nodded, like they knew exactly what I was talking about. I sold what little gold I had and bought a ticket east. I never went back to Mount Shasta after that. To this day, I can still see it in my mind, that hairy giant lifting my sluice like it was nothing and smashing it to bits. The raw power in that moment, the way it looked at me, it's haunted me ever since. I've spent years wondering what those things are, where they come from, but I'll never know. All I know is that I saw something that day that changed me forever, and no amount of time can make that fear go away. Story 7. Okay, so this happened back in June of 1993. I've never really talked about it much, outside of a few close friends, but it's one of those things that just sticks with you, you know? Like, it's been years, and I still get this cold feeling in my gut when I think about it. I'm writing this down because maybe putting it out there will help, or maybe someone else has been through something similar. I don't know, but I need to get it off my chest. So at the time, I was living in this cabin I owned on Still Creek Road in Rhododendron, Oregon. It's way out in the boonies, surrounded by dense forest, mostly cedars and firs, and the nearest town is a good 20-minute drive away. I'd bought the place a couple years before as a fixer-upper, and I was spending most of my weekends there working on it bit by bit. That particular day, I was getting ready to roof the structure. The old shingles were starting to curl and leak, and I knew if I didn't get it done soon, the whole place would be a mess come winter. I woke up early that morning around 6 o'clock. The air was cool and damp, with that earthy smell you only get deep in the woods. I remember making a pot of coffee on my camp stove because the cabin didn't have power hooked up yet, just a generator for tools. I drank it black, standing on the porch, looking out at the trees. It was quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat. My Rottweiler Sheba was with me. She was a big, loyal dog, not the type to spook easily. She'd been snoozing at my feet while I had my coffee, but then she perked up, ears twitching. I didn't think much of it at first. Could have been a squirrel or a deer moving around, but then she started growling, low and deep in her throat. I turned to look at her, and her whole body was rigid, hackles raised like I'd never seen before. That got my attention. She was staring hard into the tree line about 40 yards away where the cedars thicken up. I followed her gaze, squinting, trying to see what had her so on edge. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows and branches moving in the breeze, but then I caught it, a dark, massive shape shifting behind the trees. It was huge, way taller than any man, I'd say, over 8 feet easy. It was covered in dark brown hair, almost black in the dim light. And it had this large, rounded head. Its arms were long, swinging low, down to its knees, and it moved slowly, deliberately, like it was trying not to be seen. It kept using the trees for cover, stepping from behind one cedar to the next, always staying partially hidden. But I could tell it was watching me, not in a casual way, but intense, like it was studying me. My heart started pounding right then. I mean, I've seen bears out here, black bears mostly. But this was nothing like that. Bears don't move like that, all stealthy and calculated, and they don't have that kind of posture. This thing was upright, walking on two legs, but with a slight stoop, like it was built for moving through thick brush. I could hear faint brushing sounds as it moved, like its hair or feet were rustling against the undergrowth. It was soft, but in the quiet, it stood out. Sheba was frozen solid beside me. Not a sound now, just this tense stillness. That scared me more than the growling. She's a brave dog, but she was terrified. I could feel it radiating off her. My own hands started shaking, and I had to clench them into fists to steady myself. I remember thinking, what the hell is that? But my mind was racing, trying to process it. I was alone out there, miles from anyone, with no cell service back then. The cabin felt small and exposed all of a sudden. I took a step back towards the door, but I didn't want to turn my back on it. The creature kept moving, always keeping a tree between us, but it was edging closer. Not fast, but steadily. I could see its eyes, dark, deep-set, and intelligent. That's what got me the most. It didn't look like an animal. It looked like it was thinking, assessing the situation. I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind that makes your hair stand on end. This wasn't just some random wildlife encounter. It felt personal, like I was being stalked. I decided I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there. So I shouted, "Hey, get out of here!" My voice came out shaky but loud. The creature paused for a second, just stopped dead in its tracks. It tilted its head slightly, like it was considering what I'd said. Then it took another step forward, still using the trees, but now it was maybe 30 yards away. The sheer size of it hit me all over again. It was massive, bulky, like it could tear through the cabin if it wanted to. The silence was deafening. No birds, no wind, just that faint brushing sound and my own ragged breathing. I thought about running inside, but what good would that do? The cabin wasn't fortified, it was just wood and nails. I had a rifle inside, but it was unloaded, and I'd have to go in to get it. I didn't want to take my eyes off the thing, so I stood my ground, shouting again, "Leave me alone, go on!" But it didn't react like an animal would. No snarling, no charging. It just kept moving, slow and steady, like it had all the time in the world. The fear was overwhelming by then. My stomach was in knots, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cool air. Sheba was still frozen, pressed against my leg, trembling. I kept thinking about how far I was from help. If something happened, no one would know for days. My fiancé was supposed to come by later with supplies, but that was hours away. I felt trapped, like the woods were closing in on me. Then, after what felt like an eternity, but probably only a few minutes, I heard the distant sound of a truck engine, my fiancé's pickup, coming down the gravel road. The creature must have heard it too, because it stopped moving and looked towards the sound. For a second it just stood there, and I got a clearer view of it. The hair was matted and thick, like it had been through rough terrain, and the muscles in its arms and shoulders were defined, powerful. Then, in the blink of an eye, it turned and vanished into the shadows of the trees. No sound, no rustling, nothing. It was just gone. I stood there for a moment, stunned, before Sheba let out a low whine and started to relax a little. The truck pulled up, and my fiancé got out, asking what was wrong because I must have looked pale as a ghost. I tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled. We went over to the tree line where I'd seen it, and all we found was some scuffed soil, like something heavy had been standing there, and a few broken twigs. No tracks, nothing definitive. The woods around us felt eerily still, like everything was holding its breath. Even the birds hadn't started chirping again. Sheba stayed tense for hours after that, pacing around the cabin, growling at nothing. I couldn't focus on the roofing. My hands were still shaking, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The whole encounter lasted about 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. What stuck with me was how intelligent it seemed, the way it used cover, the cautious behavior, the way it disappeared without a sound. It wasn't some mindless beast. It was calculating, and the memory of those eyes watching me, it haunts me to this day. I've never gone back into those woods alone, and I sold the cabin a few years later. Every time I hear a story about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, I think back to that day and know, without a doubt, that something was out there, stalking the perimeter of my home. It was a silent threat, and it left me with a deep fear of the dense forests around rhododendron. Even now, decades later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching. Story 8. Okay, so I've been sitting on this for a while, and I don't really know where else to put it. I've never told anyone this, not even my family, because honestly, who'd believe me? But I need to get it out there, and maybe someone here has had something similar happen. This was back in Adams County, Pennsylvania, in the Moshannon State Forest, near this area called Ticktock and Pine Ridge Lane. I'm a bow hunter, have been for years, and I've spent countless mornings out in the woods. But nothing, and I mean nothing, ever came close to what happened that day. It was early morning, still dark out, maybe around 5 o'clock. I'd parked my truck off this dirt road and hiked in about a mile or so to my usual spot. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your ears and makes your breath fog up in little clouds. I remember thinking it was a perfect day for hunting. Quiet, no wind, just the kind of stillness where you can hear every little rustle. I was making my way through these dense laurel thickets, the kind where the branches are so tight you have to push through them and they scrape against your camo gear. My bow was slung over my shoulder, and I had my backpack with some water and snacks, nothing fancy. I've done this route dozens of times, so I knew it like the back of my hand. But that morning, something felt off right from the start. Usually the forest is alive with sounds, squirrels chattering, birds waking up, maybe a distant owl. But this time, it was dead silent. Not just quiet, but like someone had hit a mute button. No birds, no rustling, nothing. It was eerie, and I remember my skin starting to prickle like I was being watched. I shook it off at first, thinking maybe it was just the weather or something. But the silence kept pressing in, making the hairs on my arms stand up. I kept pushing through the thickets, heading toward my tree stand, which was set up in a spot where I've had good luck before. It's about 20 feet up in an old oak tree, overlooking a small clearing. As I got closer, maybe 100 yards away, that's when I heard it. A deep, powerful howl that cut through the silence like a knife. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard, not a coyote, not a bear, nothing. It was low and guttural, almost like a roar mixed with a scream, and it echoed through the trees in a way that made my blood run cold. I froze right there, my heart hammering in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking, and I had to grip my bow tighter to steady them. For a second I thought maybe it was some kind of machinery or a person messing around, but out there, no way. This was something else. I stood there for what felt like forever, just listening, but the howl didn't come again. The silence returned, but it was even heavier now, like the forest was holding its breath. I forced myself to move, telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just a weird echo or something, but my gut was screaming at me to turn back. I didn't, though. I kept going, climbing up into my tree stand as quietly as I could. The stand is this small platform with a rail, and I settled in, trying to calm my breathing. I remember the wood creaking under my boots, and I winced at every little sound, hoping nothing had heard me. I must have been up there for about half an hour, just scanning the area, when all of a sudden the deer came bursting out of the brush below. Not just one or two, but a whole group of them, maybe 6 or 7, running like hell was on their heels. They weren't graceful or quiet, they were crashing through the undergrowth, their eyes wide with panic. I'd never seen deer act like that. They usually move carefully. But this was pure terror. My first thought was that a predator was after them, maybe a coyote pack or a bear, but then I heard the footsteps, heavy, bipedal footsteps, thud, 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 like someone was running on 2 legs, but with so much weight that the ground shook. I could feel the vibrations through the tree, and my stomach dropped. I leaned forward, peering through the leaves, and that's when I saw it. A massive figure, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in matted brown hair, running through the clearing. It was moving fast, so fast I could barely process it. The hair was dark and shaggy, almost like it was caked with mud, and its arms were swinging as it ran, powerful and coordinated. It wasn't loping like a bear. This was upright, like a person, but bigger and more fluid. I could see the muscles rippling under the fur, and for a split second it turned its head and I caught a glimpse of its face. Dark, deep-set eyes and a flat nose. It was only a moment, but it's burned into my memory. My whole body went cold. I was gripping the rail of the stand so tight my knuckles were white and I couldn't breathe. I thought, this can't be real. It's a bear. It has to be a bear. But bears don't run on 2 legs like that, and they're not that tall. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, 2 more came out of the trees. One was slightly smaller, but still huge, and it had a juvenile with it, clinging to its side. The juvenile was about 4 or 5 feet tall, covered in lighter brown hair, and it moved in a clumsy, almost playful way, but the adults were all business. They paused for a second, maybe 10 yards from my tree, and the big one, the first one I saw, looked around, its head swiveling like it was scanning the area. That's when the smell hit me. Oh God, the smell. It was foul, like rotting garbage mixed with wet dog, and something else, something metallic. It was so strong I gagged, and I had to cover my mouth to keep from vomiting. My eyes were watering, and I could taste it in the back of my throat, this acrid, sickening odor that seemed to cling to the air. I've been around dead animals and skunks, but this was worse, like it was coming from something alive and decaying at the same time. The creatures didn't seem to notice me. They were focused on something else, moving together in this weird, coordinated way. The big one made a low grunting sound, and the others responded like they were communicating. Then, as quickly as they appeared, they turned and vanished downhill, crashing through the brush but fading fast, like they knew exactly where they were going. The forest went dead silent again. No birds, no wind, nothing. I stayed in that tree stand for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. My heart was still racing, and I was trembling so bad I thought I'd fall out of the tree. I kept expecting them to come back to climb up after me, but nothing happened. The silence was deafening, and I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like I was in a place I wasn't supposed to be. I finally gathered enough courage to climb down, my legs shaking so much I almost slipped on the rungs. Once I was on the ground, I didn't look back. I just started running, crashing through the thickets, not caring about noise or anything. All I wanted was to get back to my truck. I made it to the road, my lungs burning, and I drove home as fast as I could. I didn't stop to pack up my gear or anything. I left it all there. When I got home, I locked the doors and sat in my living room, just staring at the wall. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I kept smelling that foul odor like it had followed me home. I took a shower, scrubbing myself raw, but I couldn't get the smell out of my nose. For days, I couldn't sleep, jumping at every little sound. I never went back to that area, not even to retrieve my stand. A few weeks later, I drove out there with a friend, but we stayed on the road. We saw some broken branches and what looked like knocks on trees, big, deep marks that didn't look natural. That confirmed it for me. Whatever I saw, there's more than one out there, living in those remote ridges. I still don't know what to make of it. Was it Bigfoot, Sasquatch? I don't know, but it was real, and it scared the hell out of me. To this day, I can't explain it, and I doubt I ever will. Dirty Story 9. It was the summer of 2016, and I was down in Tennessee visiting my cousin. He'd moved there a few years back, and me and my buddy Mark drove down from Ohio to spend a week with him. His family had a decent bit of land, not a huge farm or anything, but enough woods out back that you could get properly lost if you didn't know your way. The plan was simple. Relax, catch up, and do some small game hunting. Squirrel mostly, maybe a rabbit if we got lucky. The first couple days were normal, hot, sticky, the kind of heat that makes your shirt cling to your back by 9 in the morning. The woods were loud with life, cicadas buzzing, birds calling, the rustle of things in the undergrowth. It felt alive. But on the third day, that changed. We decided to go deeper, to follow one of the old logging roads and try to find the back property line. My cousin said it was about 2 miles in, marked by a rusted-out wire fence that was more of a suggestion than a boundary. The three of us set out around midday, me, Mark and my cousin. We had our shotguns, a backpack with some water and snacks, nothing fancy. It was maybe a half hour into the walk that I first noticed it. The woods got quiet, not just a little quiet, but dead quiet. The constant background hum of insects just stopped, like someone threw a switch. The birds were gone. We kept walking, but we were all noticing it, glancing at each other. You don't realize how much noise a forest makes until it suddenly isn't making any. It was unnerving, but we brushed it off. Maybe a storm coming, or a predator nearby that spooked everything. We figured a fox or a bobcat had passed through. We found the property line, or what was left of it. A few rotting fence posts and some barbed wire half swallowed by a tree. We hung out there for a bit, ate a granola bar, but the silence was pressing in on us. It felt wrong. We decided to head back, not saying much. The walk back felt longer, and the quiet stayed with us the whole way. It was a relief to get back to the edge of the woods and hear a dog barking in the distance. That night, we built a bonfire down by the pond. It was a tradition. The pond was about 100 yards from the house, a dark, still sheet of water reflecting the firelight. It was a nice night, cooler than the day had been, and we were just sitting around, shooting the breeze, drinking a couple of beers. The normal forest sounds had come back, which was a comfort. Crickets, frogs down by the water, the occasional hoot of an owl. It felt like the world had righted itself. Mark decided to call it a night a little before midnight. He was tired from the walk, he said. He'd take the shotgun back to the house with him. It was a pump action, loaded with 6 rounds of buckshot. He slung it over his shoulder, said, "See you guys in the morning," and started walking up the gentle slope towards the dim lights of the house. We watched him go, his figure swallowed by the darkness between the firelight and the porch light a couple minutes later. The silence after he left felt heavier than before. My cousin was telling a story about some guy he worked with, but I was only half listening. I was just staring into the fire, letting the warmth soak into my jeans. Then the shots came. They weren't spaced out. They were rapid, one after the other. Bam, 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 bam. All 6 rounds, fired as fast as you can work the pump on a shotgun. The sound was brutally loud in the night silence, echoing across the pond and bouncing back from the tree line. My cousin and I just looked at each other for a split second, our faces frozen. Then we were on our feet, running. We didn't say a word. We just ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the branches slapping our faces. My heart was hammering in my throat, a cold metallic fear flooding my system. All I could think was bear. He'd surprised a bear. A black bear wouldn't usually charge, but if you got between a mom and her cubs, 6 shots was a lot. It was a bad sign. We found him maybe 100 yards from the house, just off the path. He was standing rigid, perfectly still, like a statue. The shotgun was hanging loose in one hand, the barrel pointing at the ground. The smell of burnt gunpowder was sharp in the air. The porch light from the house cast a weak yellow glow on him, and in that light, his face was the color of old paper. He was sheet white, his eyes wide open, staring straight ahead at nothing. "Mark," I said, my voice coming out as a croak. I grabbed his arm. It was hard as a rock, every muscle tensed. He didn't look at me. He just kept staring into the darkness of the woods in front of him. His breath was hitching in his chest. "Mark, what happened? Was it a bear?" He shook his head. A tiny, stiff movement. His lips were trembling. It took him a few seconds to form words. "It wasn't a bear," he whispered. His voice was thin and ragged. He finally turned his head to look at me, and the raw terror in his eyes made my stomach drop. It was a look I'd never seen on another person before. It was pure, undiluted fear. "I was walking," he started, his words coming in a rushed, shaky stream. "I heard something. A branch snap over to my left. I stopped, thought it was a deer. I looked, and it was just there, standing in the trees." "Standing?" my cousin asked, his own voice tight. "On two legs," Mark said, his eyes getting even wider, if that was possible. "It was tall. Really tall, 8, 9 feet maybe. I couldn't see it clearly, it was all shadows, but its eyes," he shuddered, a full-body convulsion. "They were wide set, far apart, and they were just staring at me. It wasn't moving, it was just standing there, looking down at me." He said he was only about 10 feet away from it. He yelled, "Hey, get out of here!" Nothing. He yelled again, his voice cracking with panic. The thing didn't flinch, it didn't make a sound. It just kept staring. "That's when I shot," he said, his voice dropping back to a whisper. I pointed and I started firing. I didn't aim, I just pumped and fired until it was empty. I saw the muzzle flash, lighted up for a second with each shot. It was dark, covered in hair, I think, and after the last shot it turned and ran. It didn't make a sound, no roar, no cry. It just ran off into the woods. It was fast, so fast. We didn't wait around. The three of us ran the rest of the way to the house, slammed the door shut and locked it. We sat in the kitchen with the lights on, not talking much. My cousin got his own rifle down from the rack. We were all trying to rationalize it. A bear standing on its hind legs, a trick of the shadows. Mark was spooked from the quiet woods earlier. He'd imagined it. He'd fired at a shadow. That had to be it. But the look on his face, that wasn't the look of someone who'd shot at a shadow. We eventually went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I was wound tighter than a spring. My cousin offered me the barn loft to sleep in. It was quieter, cooler, and he had a friend staying in the guest room. I took him up on it. Maybe getting away from the main house would help. The loft was spacious, filled with the sweet smell of hay. There was a single horse in a stall below, a big, calm gelding. I laid out my sleeping bag on an old mattress, the events of the night replaying over and over in my head. The silence, the shots, Mark's face. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake. It was the sound. It started low, a guttural, vibrating roar that seemed to come from deep in the earth. Then it rose quickly into a shriek, a scream that was impossibly loud, tearing through the night. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't a bobcat's scream or a fox's cry. It was something else entirely. It was a voice, but not a human one. It was full of rage and pain and something ancient, and it didn't stop. It went on, a continuous ear-splitting wall of sound that felt like it was drilling directly into my brain. I was frozen on that mattress, my hands clamped over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was so powerful, it was physical, vibrating in my chest, rattling my teeth. It was coming from the same direction Mark had fired his shots, from the deep woods by the pond. It lasted for what felt like forever. Later, we'd guess it was about 30 seconds, but in that moment, it felt like an hour, a continuous, unbroken scream of pure horror. The horse downstairs went crazy, whinnying in panic, kicking the walls of its stall. The entire forest, which had been full of its nighttime noises, went utterly, profoundly silent. The crickets stopped. The frogs stopped. Everything just stopped and listened to that scream, and then it cut off, abruptly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the scream had been. It was a thick, heavy, waiting silence. I lay there in the dark, trembling uncontrollably, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I just stared at the dark rafters above me, too scared to even breathe too loud. The next morning, the world was normal again. Birds were singing. The sun was up. It felt like a dream, a bad nightmare. But the memory of that scream was etched into me, a cold brand on my nerves. We all gathered outside, pale and tired. My cousin had heard it from the house. Mark had heard it. We didn't talk about it. We just got our boots on and went back to the spot. We searched for an hour. We looked for blood, for fur, for tracks, for any sign of what Mark had shot at, for anything that could have made that sound. The ground was soft in places from a rain a few days before. We found our own footprints from the night before, the scuffed up leaves where we'd found Mark, but we found nothing from the creature, no massive footprints, no tufts of hair caught on branches, no drag marks. Then my cousin pointed. There, on the trunk of a thick oak tree, about 5 feet off the ground, was a dark, wet-looking spot about the size of my palm. It was smeared, like something had brushed against it. It could have been sap, it could have been rain, but it was the only thing that was even remotely out of place in the entire area. We looked at the tree behind it, no buckshot impacts. We looked at all the trees in a wide arc. Nothing. 6 rounds of buckshot, fired from close range, and not a single pellet had hit a tree. That was the moment it really sank in. Mark hadn't missed. He'd fired all 6 shells directly at a massive target 10 feet away. He must have hit it. He had to have hit it. Buckshot spreads. At that range, it would have been a devastating blast. Whatever it was, it had taken 6 close-range shots from a shotgun loaded with buckshot. And it had not only survived, but it had run away. And then, hours later, it had screamed its rage into the night with a sound that defied any known animal in those woods. We walked back to the house in silence. We never went hunting in those woods again for the rest of the trip. We stayed close to the house. I've turned it over in my head for years since then. A bear would have been injured, would have left a blood trail, would have made a different sound. A person would have been killed. There is no animal in North America that fits what we experienced. The height, the silence, the resilience to gunfire, and that scream, that unnatural, world-stopping scream. I don't know what it was. I don't like to use the word. It sounds crazy. But in my gut, in the part of me that still feels that primal chill when I think about it, I know something was out there that night, something that shouldn't exist. And it looked at us, and we shot at it, and it told the whole forest exactly what it thought of us. I've never been so scared in my life before or since. I still hear that scream sometimes when it's very quiet. I don't think I'll ever forget it. Mad story 10. Okay, so this happened back in October 2017. I'm Richard Taylor, and I was part of a small research team, 6 of us total, down in the river bottom area of the Little River in southeast Oklahoma. We were there to document any unusual activity, mostly because of local reports about strange sounds and sightings. I've been into this stuff for years, but nothing could have prepared me for that day. It's been stuck in my head ever since, and I still get chills thinking about it. I'm just gonna lay it out like it happened, because I need to get this off my chest. We started out early that morning, way before sunrise. It was one of those crisp October days where the air feels thin and cold, and you can see your breath hanging in front of you, like a little cloud. The sky was pitch black, no moon out, so we were relying on our headlamps and night vision gear. We'd parked our trucks about a mile upstream and hiked in, carrying all our equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and my thermal imaging scope, which I'd saved up for months to buy. The plan was to set up near a spot where the river bends, because that's where most of the weird noises had been reported. The ground was soft and muddy from recent rains, and every step sunk in a little, making this squelching sound that seemed way too loud in the silence. As we moved deeper into the brush, the darkness felt heavier, like it was pressing in on us. The trees were thick with leaves that hadn't fallen yet, so even with our lights, we could only see a few feet ahead. We were trying to be quiet, but it was impossible not to make noise, twigs snapping under our boots, the rustle of our jackets. After about 20 minutes of walking, I started hearing something else. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving through the undergrowth. But then it got clearer. Footfalls. Not like ours, though. These were heavier, with a steady rhythm, and they were flanking us on both sides. I could hear them crunching through the leaves and snapping small branches, keeping pace with us, no matter how fast or slow we went. I remember my heart starting to beat faster, and I could feel this cold sweat on the back of my neck. I glanced over at the others, and from the way they were looking around, I knew they heard it too. One of the guys, Mark, he whispered, "You hearing that?" And we all nodded, not saying much else. We kept moving, but the sounds stayed with us, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, like whatever it was playing with us. The air smelled damp and earthy, with a hint of decay from the riverbank, and every time I took a breath, it felt like I was sucking in fear. Then things got weirder. We were about halfway to our target spot when the first rock came flying out of the darkness. It wasn't a big one, maybe the size of a baseball, but it hit a tree trunk right next to Mark's head with a loud thwack. We all froze, and for a second, nobody said anything. Then another one came, this time from the other side, and it landed in the mud at our feet. After that, it was like a barrage, rocks and broken branches being thrown at us from different directions. Not randomly, though. They were aimed like someone or something was trying to scare us off without hitting us directly. I ducked behind a tree, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold my gear. The panic in the group was palpable. I could hear people breathing fast, muttering curses, and one of the women, Sarah, she started crying softly. I felt this knot in my stomach like I was going to be sick, but we had to keep it together. We decided to push on, because we were researchers, damn it, and we hadn't come all this way to turn back at the first sign of trouble. But the throwing didn't stop. Branches would whiz past our ears, and rocks would thud into the ground around us. At one point, a bigger branch, maybe as thick as my arm, landed right in front of me, and I jumped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The accuracy was insane. It felt like we were being targeted by something that knew exactly where we were, even in the dark. We turned off our headlamps to avoid giving away our position, but that just made it worse. Now, we were blind, relying on the faint starlight filtering through the trees. And the footfalls got louder, closer. That's when I pulled out my thermal scope. I'd brought it for situations like this, but I never thought I'd actually need it. My hands were still trembling as I switched it on, and the world lit up in shades of red and orange. At first, I just saw the heat signatures of my teammates huddled together and the cooler blues of the trees and ground. But then I scanned to the left toward where the footfalls were coming from, and I saw it. A figure standing maybe 30 yards away, behind a thick oak tree. It was tall, over 6 feet easily, and its heat signature was intense like a living furnace. But what got me was the shape. It wasn't human. There were no clothing lines, no seams or pockets, just this solid, muscular form that moved with a smooth, almost fluid motion. It peeked out from behind the tree, and I could see the outline of a broad chest and long arms. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my breath caught in my throat. I quickly handed the scope to Mark, and when he looked, his face went pale. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, and I just shook my head. I didn't have an answer. We kept the scope on it for a few minutes, and it just stood there, watching us. Then it moved again, circling around to our right, and we heard more footfalls. The throwing started up again, but now it was more intense. Objects were whizzing past us in the dark, not just rocks and branches, but clumps of mud and what felt like small stones. One hit my shoulder and it stung like crazy, leaving a bruise that lasted for days. We felt hunted, completely exposed, like we were prey in its territory. The fear was so thick I could taste it, metallic and sour in my mouth. My legs felt weak, and I had to lean against a tree to steady myself. I remember thinking, this is it. We're not going to make it out of here. But we couldn't just run. We had to document this. So we kept recording. I had my camera out, shooting video in the dark, and Mark was using the thermal scope to track the figure. We captured it moving through the brush, sometimes quick, sometimes slow, always staying just out of reach. At one point, it got so close that I could hear its breathing, a deep, guttural sound that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was low and rhythmic, almost like a growl, but softer. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I had to fight the urge to bolt. We were all on edge, jumping at every little noise, and the darkness seemed to swallow us whole. The river was nearby, and I could hear the water flowing, but it was drowned out by the sounds of whatever was out there with us. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, the activity died down. The throwing stopped, and the footfalls faded into the distance. We waited, barely breathing, until the first light of dawn started to break through the trees. The sky turned from black to grey, and slowly we could see our surroundings again. The forest looked normal, peaceful even, but the fear hadn't left us. We packed up our gear and hiked back to the trucks in silence. Nobody said much. We were all too shaken. Back at our base camp, which was just a rented cabin nearby, we started going through the footage. My hands were still shaky as I plugged the camera into my laptop, and when we pulled up the thermal images, my stomach dropped. There it was, clear as day, that tall figure peeking out from behind a tree. In the slow-motion video, you could see it side-peeking, like it was curious but cautious. The details were unmistakable. No clothes, just this hairy, humanoid shape that moved with a grace I've never seen in any animal. We enhanced the images, and you could even see the muscles flexing under the skin. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a suit. This was something else entirely. We spent the rest of the day analyzing everything, and the more we looked, the more we realized this wasn't some prank or hoax. The accuracy of the thrown objects, the way it moved, the thermal signatures, it all pointed to one thing: Bigfoot, or whatever people call it. I'd always been skeptical, but after that day, I couldn't deny it. We had evidence, solid evidence, and it left me with this renewed sense of respect and fear for whatever these things are. They're smart, they're strong, and they know how to stay hidden. I still think about that day all the time, especially when I'm out in the woods. The memory of those footfalls, the rocks flying past, and that figure in the thermal scope, it's burned into my brain. I don't have any explanations, and I probably never will. All I know is that we weren't alone out there, and whatever it was, it knew we were watching. Story 11. Okay, I'll try to write this. I've never really written it all down before, just told a couple of close friends, and even then I left a lot out. But I can't get it out of my head, especially around this time of year, so maybe typing it out will help, or maybe it'll just freak me out all over again. Either way, here it is. This was late September, back in 2016. I'd taken my little camping trailer up to Redfish Lake in Idaho for a few days of quiet, just me, some books, and no cell service. It was supposed to be a reset. I'd been feeling burned out from work, and the idea of sitting by a lake with a fishing rod sounded like heaven. The first couple of days were perfect. Cold, crisp air, the kind that makes you feel alive, and the woods were so quiet you could hear a leaf drop 100 feet away. My trailer was an old, small thing, maybe 16 feet long, just enough for a bed, a tiny kitchen and a table. It felt cozy, not cramped. I was parked in a spot that was a bit more secluded than the others, tucked back near a thicker part of the woods, which is exactly what I wanted. The second day I was there, I met my neighbor. He was an older guy, probably in his late 60s, with one of those big, comfortable fifth-wheel trailers. He seemed like a seasoned camper, the kind who knew how to fix anything with duct tape and a pocket knife. We got to talking by the shared water spigot, just casual stuff, the weather, the fishing, that kind of thing. He was friendly, but there was something a little distant in his eyes, like he was thinking about something else. Later that same afternoon, I saw him again outside his trailer, just staring off into the trees. I waved, and he came over. He said his name was Jerry. We chatted for a minute, and then he sort of lowered his voice and said, "You hear anything weird last night?" I told him I hadn't. I'd slept like a rock. He nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Around 2, 3 in the morning, he said. I heard something walking around my trailer, slow, heavy footsteps, just circling. I figured it was probably a moose or an elk. They're big animals, and they can sound like a person sometimes. But he shook his head. No, I know what a moose sounds like. This was different. It was deliberate, like it was taking its time. And I felt watched. You know that feeling when the hair on your neck stands up for no reason? I had that for hours. I remember trying to make a joke of it. Maybe it's Bigfoot, I said, smiling. He didn't smile back. He just looked at me, dead serious, and said, maybe it is. Then he went back to his trailer. I shrugged it off. The guy was probably just a little jumpy, or maybe he'd had a bad dream. I didn't think any more about it. That night, everything changed. I'd made dinner, read for a bit by the light of my little battery-powered lamp, and turned in around 10. The trailer was dark and warm. I fell asleep pretty quickly. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was the middle of the night, pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't see your own hand in front of your face. I wasn't sure why I'd woken up. I just laid there for a second, listening. And then I realized what it was, the silence. It was absolute. No crickets, no wind rustling the leaves, no distant owl hoots. Nothing. It was an unnatural, heavy silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. That was the first thing that put me on edge, that uneasy stillness. I held my own breath, straining to hear something, anything. My heart was starting to thump a little harder in my chest. Then I heard it, a single, heavy crunch. It was outside, in the dirt and pine needles around my trailer. It was the sound of a footstep, a big one. It wasn't a twig snapping. It was the sound of weight, a lot of weight, compressing the forest floor. I froze. My whole body went stiff. I was lying on my side on the bed, and I didn't move a muscle. Crunch. Another one, slow, methodical. It was moving, circling. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a bear. I'd read about bears in the area. But this didn't sound like a bear's four-legged gait. This was a slow, steady, two-part rhythm. Step, pause, step, pause. Like something walking on 2 feet. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear them moving from the front of my trailer, along the side, past the window near my head. Each step was a deep, solid thump that I could feel through the thin floor of the trailer. The whole trailer seemed to vibrate slightly with each impact. It stopped right next to my door. I stopped breathing altogether. My eyes were wide open, staring into the darkness of the trailer wall, but I was seeing nothing. All my senses were focused on the sound outside that door. The silence stretched on for what felt like a full minute. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. This is when the real fear started to set in. It wasn't just nervousness anymore. It was a cold, sharp terror that started in my gut and spread out to my fingers and toes, making them feel numb. My skin was crawling. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that there was something right outside that flimsy metal door, and it knew I was in here. Then I heard a new sound. It was a soft, scraping drag against the metal siding of the trailer. It started near the front and moved slowly towards the door. It didn't sound like a branch. It was too intentional. It sounded like something was being dragged along the wall. A hand, a claw, I don't know. But it was a dry, rasping scrape that set my teeth on edge. The scraping stopped right by the door. I was paralyzed. I couldn't have moved if I'd wanted to. I was just a lump of fear lying in a bed, praying to whatever might be listening that this thing would just go away. My mind was racing, picturing what could be out there. Jerry's words came back to me. Slow, heavy footsteps, just circling. I felt watched. Oh God, I felt watched. I felt like whatever it was peering right through the walls, right through the door, right into me. It knew I was scared. It knew I was awake. It was playing with me. The thing outside let out a sound. It wasn't a growl, not really. It was a low, deep, rumbling exhale. I felt it more than heard it, a deep vibration that passed through the trailer's frame. It was a sound of immense size, a sound that came from a chest bigger than any man's. Then nothing. The footsteps started again, but they were moving away now. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They faded into the trees, getting quieter and quieter until they were gone. The forest sounds didn't come back right away. The silence lingered for another few minutes, heavy and threatening. Then tentatively, a cricket started chirping, then another. The normal night slowly returned, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I stayed frozen in that same position for what felt like hours, just listening, my body aching from the tension. I must have eventually fallen into a fitful, terrified sleep, because the next thing I knew, grey dawn light was filtering through the little window over my bed. I was still curled up in a ball. For a few seconds, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it had been a dream, a horrible, vivid nightmare. I sat up slowly. Every muscle in my body was sore. I swung my legs out of bed, and my feet hit the cold linoleum floor. I needed to see. I had to know. I walked to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the lock. I turned it slowly, the click sounding impossibly loud in the morning quiet. I cracked the door open just an inch and peered out. The world outside looked normal. The trees, the lake in the distance, the morning mist. It looked peaceful. I opened the door a little wider and stepped down onto the metal step, and that's when I saw them. In the soft, damp soil right next to my trailer, there were footprints. I crouched down, my heart hammering all over again. They were huge, I mean massive. I wear a size 11 shoe, and I put my foot next to one of the prints. It was easily half again as long and twice as wide. They were deep, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The shape was all wrong for a bear. Bears have paws with claws. These looked almost humanoid, but not quite. The toes were long, and the arch was very pronounced. They weren't clean prints. The edges were blurred from what looked like hair, but the basic shape was clear. My blood ran cold. This was real. It hadn't been a dream. I followed the prints with my eyes. They came out of the woods, made a perfect circle around my trailer, paused for a long time by my door, and then headed back into the trees. Right where I'd heard the scraping sound on the metal, the prints were dug in deep, as if it had stood there, shifting its weight. I stood up, my legs feeling weak. I looked over at Jerry's campsite. His big fifth wheel was gone. Just gone. An empty patch of gravel where it had been. He must have hooked up and left in the dead of night or first thing in the morning before the sun was even fully up. He hadn't just been jumpy. He'd known. That was the final straw for me. The footprints, the memory of that sound, the scraping, the feeling of being watched, and now Jerry fleeing without a word. I didn't need any more convincing. I didn't even make coffee. I didn't eat breakfast. I just started packing. My hands were still shaking as I wound up the power cord, stowed the steps, and hitched the trailer to my truck. I did it all in a frantic, terrified rush, constantly looking over my shoulder at the tree line. I felt exposed, like I was being timed. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again. It took me less than 20 minutes to get everything secured. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and peeled out of that campground, kicking up gravel behind me. I didn't look back. I just drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, not slowing down until I was miles away, back on a main highway with other cars around me. I got home, unpacked nothing, and just tried to forget about it. I told myself it was a bear, a weird bear, and that was that. But about a week later, I was scrolling through the news on my laptop, and a small article from the Idaho Statesman caught my eye. It was about a missing hiker. A guy in his 20s had gone for a day hike in the Sawtooth Wilderness near Redfish Lake the same week I was there. He never came back. Search and rescue found some of his gear, but no sign of him. I remember just staring at that article, the words blurring on the screen. My throat went dry. I wasn't thinking about bears anymore. I was thinking about those heavy, deliberate footsteps circling my trailer in the dead of night. I was thinking about that low, rumbling exhale. I was thinking about something big and smart enough to stalk a campsite, to scare two grown men into fleeing, and to just vanish back into the woods without a trace. The thought that hit me, the one that still haunts me now, is that it's still out there. Whatever it was, it didn't get me that night. It didn't get Jerry. But that hiker, he might not have been so lucky, and the woods are still there, just as big and dark and silent as ever. I haven't been camping since. Story 12. It was one of those late summer days that felt like it would never end, the kind where the heat just sits on you, heavy and damp. Must have been 1976, maybe 77. I was 15, 16 years old, and I was out in the fields off Route 422, near where Mushroom Mine Road cuts through. We were throwing hay. It was just what you did back then. You didn't get a choice. If you were old enough to lift a bale, you were old enough to work. The field was this big rolling stretch of land that sloped down towards a thick line of woods. Beyond those woods were the mushroom mines. You could sometimes smell them on the air, a weird, earthy, almost rotten smell that's hard to describe if you've never been around it. It's a smell I'll always associate with that place. The bales were heavy, scratchy as hell, and the twine would dig into your hands, even through gloves. You'd heave one up onto the flatbed wagon, then turn around and get another, over and over. Your back would be screaming by the end of the day, and your shirt would be stuck to you with sweat and hay dust. There were a few of us kids out there that day, maybe 4 or 5. We weren't talking much. It was too hot for that. We were just in a rhythm. The thump of the bales hitting the wagon bed, the sound of our own ragged breathing, the buzz of flies. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows from the trees at the edge of the field. It was that time of afternoon where everything gets a little quieter, a little stiller. I was straightening up after tossing a bale, wiping the sweat from my forehead with my arm, when I saw it. My eyes just kind of landed on it. Over by the tree line, maybe 150 yards away, there was a figure standing there. At first, my brain didn't register what it was. I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe a weird, stripped tree trunk I'd never noticed before. But then it moved. Not a lot, it was just standing upright, and it was massive. I froze. My whole body just locked up. I stopped breathing for a second. I remember my heart started hammering against my ribs, a hard, frantic beat that felt like it was shaking my whole body. I didn't say anything. I just stared. It was tall, so damn tall. I'm not good at judging height from a distance, but I'd swear on anything it was at least 8 feet tall. It was built too. Not like a skinny person, but broad through the shoulders and chest. It was covered in hair or fur, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't black, but a dark, rusty brown color, like wet bark. The sun was hitting it from the side, and I could see the definition of its shape, the way the muscles in its shoulders and arms bulged. It was just standing there near this big oak tree, and it was watching us. Its head was turned in our direction. I couldn't make out any clear features on its face from that far, no eyes or a mouth. It was just a dark shape under the shadow of its own brow, but I absolutely knew it was looking right at us. There was an intelligence to its posture, a stillness that was completely unnatural. An animal might freeze, but this was different. This was a patient, observing stillness. I finally managed to tear my eyes away from it and look at the other guys. They'd seen it too. One of them, a kid named Mike, had his mouth hanging open, a hay bale half lifted in his hands. Another kid, Jimmy, was just shaking his head slowly, back and forth, like he was trying to deny what he was seeing. Nobody made a sound. The only noise was the faint hum of the countryside and the blood pounding in my ears. We stood there like that, all of us, locked in this silent standoff with this thing. I looked at my watch. I don't know why I did that. It was just a reflex. It felt like an eternity. But when I checked the time, only 2 minutes had passed. 2 minutes of pure, undiluted terror. It's a feeling that's hard to put into words. It wasn't just fear, it was a deep, primal dread. It was the feeling of being completely and utterly out of place, like we were the intruders, and it was the one who belonged here. The air felt colder, charged, like before a storm, and then it moved. It didn't startle or run, it didn't make a sound, it just turned its body, smooth and fluid, and started to walk. It walked away from us, on 2 legs, heading parallel to the tree line, deeper into the shadows of the woods. I've seen bears walk on their hind legs, and it's a clumsy, waddling thing. This wasn't like that. This was a steady, powerful, purposeful stride. Its arms swung naturally at its sides. It moved with a grace that something that big shouldn't possess, and it was completely silent. No rustle of leaves, no snap of a twig, nothing. It just melted into the deeper shadows of the trees and was gone. The second it disappeared, the spell broke. "What the hell was that?" Mike yelled, his voice cracking. It was the first any of us had spoken. "Did you see that? Did you see how big it was?" Jimmy was practically shouting, his face pale. We all started talking at once, a jumble of panicked questions and exclamations. We dropped our hay hooks and ran to the edge of the field where it had been, but there was nothing there. No footprints that we could see in the thick grass and undergrowth, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if it had never been there at all. But we all saw it, all of us. There was no doubt in any of our minds. We didn't go back to work. We just left the wagon and the hay and ran all the way back to the farmhouse where our fathers were. We were stumbling over each other, trying to get the story out. My dad was in the barn fixing a piece of machinery. He looked up, annoyed at first by the interruption. We were all talking at once, breathless, pointing back towards the field. "Whoa, slow down," he said, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "One at a time. What's got into you boys?" "I was the one who managed to get it out. We saw something, Dad, in the field by the woods. A thing, a man, but not a man. It was huge, covered in hair, just standing there watching us." He listened, his expression shifting from annoyance to a sort of weary patience. When I finished, he just sighed. "Probably just a bear, son. They stand up sometimes. The light plays tricks out there in the evening." "It wasn't a bear," Mike insisted. "It walked. It walked on 2 legs like a person." My dad shook his head. "A bear can do that for a few steps. You boys got spooked is all. Your imaginations are running wild after being in the sun all day." We tried to argue, to explain the height, the silence, the way it moved, but he just wouldn't hear it. He told us to stop fooling around and get cleaned up for dinner. The other fathers had pretty much the same reaction. A few chuckles, a few comments about us watching too many monster movies. They dismissed it completely. That was almost worse than seeing the thing, that feeling of not being believed, of having this earth-shattering experience reduced to imagination, or a bear. It makes you feel small and stupid. It makes you doubt yourself, even though you know what you saw. We went back the next day to finish the work. The field felt different. The air was still, watchful. Every shadow in the tree line seemed to hold a shape. Every rustle in the underbrush made my heart jump. We worked fast, not talking, just wanting to get the hell out of there. And that's when the other memories started creeping back in. The things we'd dismissed or explained away before, for months. Maybe even a couple of years before that day. We'd heard things at night. We lived close enough to those woods that sounds carried. Sometimes, late at night, you'd hear a cry. It wasn't a coyote. I've heard coyotes my whole life. It's a yipping, chattering sound. This was different. It was a long, drawn-out howl, but deeper, with a guttural, almost roaring quality to it. It was a sound that didn't belong. It would raise the hair on your arms. Other times it was like a high-pitched scream, the kind that makes you sit straight up in bed. We'd always just said it was a fox or a bobcat. That's what people told us. but after seeing that thing, those sounds took on a whole new meaning. I remember one time, a few weeks before the sighting, I was walking back from a friend's house after dark. It was a clear night, a bright moon. I was cutting through the edge of a field, not far from where we saw it later. I heard something moving in the woods, something big. It wasn't the light, scampering sound of a deer. This was a heavy, deliberate crunching, like something taking slow, massive steps. I stopped dead, my flashlight beam shaking as I pointed it towards the trees. I saw nothing, but the sound stopped the moment my light hit the tree line. I stood there for a full minute, too scared to move, and then I heard it again, a single, heavy footstep, closer this time. I ran the rest of the way home, my lungs burning, not daring to look back. At the time, I convinced myself it was just a deer, a big buck, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But now I know it wasn't. That thing we saw in the field, it wasn't just passing through, it lived there. It was part of those woods, part of that landscape overlooking the mushroom mines. The silent, imposing presence we witnessed for those 2 minutes was just a glimpse. The howls and the cries in the night, the feeling of being watched, the heavy footsteps in the dark. That was the reality of it. That was its world. And we had just stumbled into the very edge of it. I'm a grown man now, with kids of my own. I've lived a whole life since that day, but I've never forgotten it, not for a single day. Sometimes, if I'm out in the woods and it gets too quiet, or if I hear a strange sound at night, that feeling comes back, the goosebumps rise on my arms, and my heart does that same frantic dance. It's a chill that goes right down to your bones, a reminder that there are things in this world that don't fit into any neat little box, things that don't care if you believe in them or not. We saw what we saw, and no amount of dismissal or rationalization from anyone will ever change that. It was real. It was there, and the memory of it, standing so still and so silent, just watching us before it walked away without a sound, is something that will be burned into my mind until the day I die. I don't know what it was. I don't have a name for it. I just know that for 2 minutes on a hot summer afternoon in the 1970s, we weren't alone in that field, and the thing that was with us was something I hope I never, ever see again. Story 13. All right, I'll just come out and say it. I saw something out there, something I can't explain, and I need to get this off my chest. My name's Charles. I grew up on a farm tucked back in the Smoky Mountains. Dirt roads, creek water, and hard work. That's my whole life. I've never been one for ghost stories or monster tales. If I can't touch it, shoot it, or mend a fence with it, I don't put much stock in it. That's how I was raised. Bigfoot. I thought it was a joke for city folks with too much time on their hands. I don't think that anymore. It happened last fall. The exact date doesn't matter, but the time is burned into my brain. 3:30 in the morning. I woke up like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water on me. 1 second I was dead asleep, the next I was bolt upright in bed, my heart trying to punch its way out of my chest. It wasn't a noise that woke me. The house was quiet. It was a feeling, a pure, simple, animal feeling of danger. Like when you're walking through the woods and you just know a snake is nearby, even if you can't see it. This was that times 100. Something was wrong. Something was outside. My bedroom window looks out over the backfield, which slopes down to a creek. We get deer there all the time, sometimes a whole herd. In the 6 years I've lived here on my own, running the place after my dad passed, I've never once seen a bear on our land. Never. So that wasn't even a thought in my head. I swung my legs out of bed and the floorboards were cold under my feet. I didn't turn on any lights in the house. I just padded through the dark to the back door, my skin prickling all over. I keep a giant spotlight by the door, one of those handheld ones that can light up the whole back 40. It's heavy, with a rechargeable battery pack. I use it for checking on the livestock or for finding a cow that's decided to calve in the middle of the night. I picked it up, my hand feeling slick on the plastic handle. I remember my breath fogging in the air in front of the door's window pane. It was that cold, crisp kind of autumn night where the sky is clear and the stars look like pinpricks in black velvet. I unlocked the deadbolt, the click sounding way too loud in the silence. I eased the door open just enough to step out onto the back porch. The wooden planks were freezing. The air smelled like damp leaves and cold water from the creek. Everything was still, no wind. I raised the spotlight, my thumb hovering over the button. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the jackhammer in my chest, and I pressed it. The beam cut through the darkness, a solid bar of white light. It swept across the field, illuminating the tall brown grass, the bare branches of the trees at the far edge. I panned it slowly toward the creek, and that's when I saw it. Down by the water, about 90 yards away, maybe a little less, there was a shape, a big, dark, furry shape, hunched over at the water's edge. My first thought, my only logical thought was, well, I'll be damned. A bear, finally. It was drinking. I could see the dark, hunched shoulders, the head dipped down. It was big for a bear, real big, but I figured it was a male, maybe a late-season boar fattening up. I kept the light on it, curious. I wasn't scared. Annoyed, maybe. I didn't want a bear getting ideas about my chickens. I watched it for maybe 10, 15 seconds, and then it stood up. It didn't rise up on its hind legs like a bear does, all slow and awkward, front paws dangling. It just stood up, straight up like a man, and my brain just broke. It didn't compute. I was looking at a bear, and then I wasn't. I was looking at something else. It was huge. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing had to be at least 8 feet, maybe more. Its chest was massive, like a barrel. I'd guess 4 feet across at least, just a wall of muscle. And it was covered in hair, but it wasn't shaggy like a bear's coat. It was sleek, almost wet-looking under the spotlight, and the color of dark mahogany wood, a deep, rich brown. The arms, God, the arms, they were long, too long. They hung down past its knees, and they were thick with muscle, ending in these enormous hands. I could see the fingers, long and thick, even from that distance. It was just standing there, facing partly away from me, and it was so still. It wasn't looking around. It was just standing, and then it turned its head. I didn't see its eyes. The spotlight was reflecting off the hair on its face, creating shadows, but I knew it was aware of the light. It knew I was there. A chill, colder than the night air, went straight down my spine. And then it leaned its head back. It tilted its head all the way back, pointing its face up at the sky. Its chest expanded, and it let out a sound, a scream. That's the only word for it. But it wasn't like any scream I've ever heard. It wasn't an animal sound, not a coyote, not a bobcat, not a bear. It was a roar and a scream and a shriek, all mixed into one, and it was deafening. The volume was unreal. It was so loud it didn't seem possible. It was the kind of sound you feel more than you hear. The sound hit me like a physical wave. I felt it. I felt ripples go through my body, from the top of my head down to the soles of my feet. It was a vibrating sensation, a deep, resonant thrumming that made my teeth ache. My organs felt like they were shaking inside me, like when you stand too close to a speaker at a concert and you feel the bass in your gut, but this was 1,000 times stronger. It was pure, raw power vibrating through the air and right through me. I could feel the wooden porch boards trembling under my bare feet. The sound went on and on, a single continuous blast of noise that lasted for what felt like forever. Later, I timed it in my head, over and over. It had to have been 30, maybe 45 seconds. It didn't take a breath, it just screamed. I was paralyzed. My hand was locked around the spotlight, still shining right on it. My mouth was hanging open. Every hair on my body was standing straight up. This wasn't curiosity or annoyance anymore. This was a terror so deep and so primal, I felt like my soul was trying to crawl out of my skin. My brain was screaming at me that this was impossible, that things like this don't exist, that I was dreaming or losing my mind. But I could feel the cold porch on my feet. I could feel the vibration in my bones. I could smell the night air. This was real. The scream stopped as suddenly as it started. The silence that followed was almost as loud, ringing in my ears. The creature, the thing, just dropped its head. It was still standing there, illuminated in my spotlight. And then it moved. It didn't lope or amble. It ran. It took off in one direction, away from the creek and along the tree line, moving with a speed that was terrifying for something that size. It wasn't clumsy. It was powerful, fluid, like a giant athlete. It covered ground in huge, bounding strides and vanished into the deep shadows of the woods in just a few seconds. The second it disappeared, the spell broke. The adrenaline that had been frozen in my veins suddenly ignited. I stumbled back, my legs feeling like rubber. I fumbled with the door, my hands shaking so bad I could barely turn the knob. I fell inside, slammed the door shut, and threw the deadbolt. I stood there in my dark kitchen, panting, my back pressed against the door, listening. I could still hear the echo of that scream in my head. My whole body was trembling. I could still feel the phantom vibrations in my chest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat at the kitchen table with my dad's old shotgun across my lap, staring at the door, jumping at every little creak and groan the old house made. The first hint of dawn was a relief. As soon as it was light enough to see, I went back outside. I had to. I walked down to the creek, my shotgun held tight. There was nothing there. No tracks in the muddy bank that I could make out clearly. The ground was a mess of deer hooves and other prints, but I knew what I saw. I stood right where it had been standing. I looked back at my house. 90 yards. I could see my back door, the porch. It was all real. I told my family about it later that day. My mom, my uncle. They laughed. They said I'd had a nightmare, that it was a bear and my imagination ran wild. They said I'd been working too hard. I stopped talking about it after that. What was the point? But I knew. I went into town and bought 6 trail cameras, the good ones, with night vision and motion sensors. I put them up all over the property, especially down by that creek. That was months ago. I've checked the cards every week. I've got thousands of pictures of deer, raccoons, possums, turkeys. Not a single sign of what I saw, but I know it was there. I can close my eyes and see it standing up, that impossible silhouette against the trees. I can feel that scream in my bones, a feeling I'll never forget. It's a hum that's always there now, just under my skin, a constant reminder that the world is a lot bigger and a hell of a lot stranger than I ever thought. I was a country boy who knew the land. Now I'm just a man who knows he doesn't know anything at all. And sometimes, on a still cold night, I'll wake up for no reason at 3:30 in the morning, and I'll lie there listening, my heart pounding, waiting to hear it again. Story 14. Okay, so this is something I've never really talked about much because, well, most people think I'm making it up or that I just let my imagination run wild. But I know what I saw, and it's stuck with me for decades. I need to get this out there, because maybe someone else has had something similar happen, and we can piece it together. This was back in the mid-70s, around mid-November of 1975. I was a student at this private school in Tucson, Arizona, one of those places where you're surrounded by desert and mountains, and if you're like me, you spend a lot of time outdoors just to clear your head. That day started like any other. I woke up early. The air was cool but not cold, typical for November in the desert. The sky was this clear, pale blue, and the sun was already warming things up. I'd always been into hiking, ever since I was a kid. It was my escape from the routine of school, from the same old buildings and the same faces. I'd pack a small bag with some water, maybe an apple, and just head out. The school was on the edge of town, so it didn't take long to get into the wilder areas. North of campus, there was this old corral that I'd heard about from some of the older students. It was supposed to be from some ranch that had been abandoned years ago, and I was curious. I'd been meaning to check it out for a while, and that day felt right. No classes in the afternoon, so I had hours to kill. I remember pulling on my jeans and a t-shirt, lacing up my boots. They were these worn-out leather things that had seen better days, but they were comfortable for walking. I grabbed my water bottle and headed out. The walk from the school grounds to the corral wasn't far, maybe a mile or so, but it felt isolated. The path was dusty, lined with mesquite trees and creosote bushes, and the ground was hard-packed dirt with scattered rocks. I could hear the occasional bird chirping, but otherwise, it was quiet, peaceful. I liked that. It gave me time to think, to just be alone with my thoughts. As I got closer to the corral, the landscape opened up a bit. The corral itself was nothing fancy, just a bunch of old, weathered wooden posts and rails, most of them leaning or fallen over. It was surrounded by patches of dry grass and a few gopher holes here and there. I'd heard that gophers were common in the area, and you could see their little mounds of dirt everywhere. I started poking around, not really looking for anything in particular, just curious about the place. The wood was splintered and grey from the sun, and it smelled like dust and decay. I remember running my hand along one of the posts, feeling the rough texture, and wondering about the people who'd built it. What was it like out here back then? That's when things started to feel off. At first it was subtle. I'd been standing there for a few minutes, just taking it all in, when I noticed the hair on my arms standing up. Not from the cold. The sun was still out and it was warm enough, but like that prickly feeling you get when someone's watching you. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a breeze or something, but then I caught a whiff of this smell. It was pungent, really strong, like a mix of wet dog and something rotten, like old meat or garbage that's been left out too long. It hit me in the back of my throat, and I almost gagged. I'd never smelled anything like that out here before. The desert usually smells clean, like sage and dry earth, but this was foul. I froze for a second, trying to figure out where it was coming from. My heart started beating a little faster, and I felt this knot forming in my stomach. I looked around, scanning the area. The corral was to my left, and beyond it, the land sloped down into a shallow wash. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound like something moving through the brush, not loud, but steady. I thought it might be a rabbit or a coyote, something normal, but the sound was too heavy, too deliberate. It wasn't the skittering of a small animal. It was more like something big shifting its weight. I took a few steps toward the sound, my curiosity overriding the unease. I peered over the edge of the corral, and that's when I saw it. Down in the wash, maybe 30 feet away, there was this large, grayish-brown, hairy creature crouched over one of the gopher dens. It was huge, way bigger than a person, but hunched over like it was digging. Its back was to me, and I could see the muscles moving under all that hair. The hair was matted and dirty, kind of shaggy, and it covered its entire body. It was using its hands to dig into the ground, and I could hear the dirt being tossed aside. Its hands were massive, with thick fingers, and they moved with this weird, powerful grace. I stood there, completely frozen. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt this cold sweat break out all over my body. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a bear? But bears aren't common around Tucson, and this didn't look like any bear I'd ever seen in pictures. It was too upright, too human-like in the way it moved. And the smell, it was overwhelming now, making my eyes water. I could taste it in the back of my mouth, this metallic, sour taste that made me want to vomit. Then it started to turn toward me, slowly, like it had sensed I was there. I saw its shoulder rotate, and its head began to shift. I didn't wait to see its face. Something in me snapped, and pure fear took over. I turned and ran. I didn't think, I just ran. My legs felt like jelly, but I pushed them as hard as I could. I was sprinting across the open ground back toward campus. The terrain was rough, rocks and cactus everywhere, and I almost tripped a couple of times. My heart was pounding so loud, I could hear it in my ears, and my lungs burned with every breath. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to feel something grabbing me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just focused on getting away, on reaching the safety of the school. The run felt like it took forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. I burst onto the campus grounds, my chest heaving, sweat pouring down my face. I must have looked insane because people were staring at me. I didn't care. I went straight to the main office and found the school secretary. She was this older woman, always kind, but she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I was babbling, trying to explain what I'd seen, but the words were coming out all jumbled. I kept saying, there was something out there, big and hairy, digging in the ground. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold them still. She calmed me down a bit and got me to sit. I drew a sketch for her on a piece of paper, a rough outline of what I'd seen. It was crude, but it captured the basic shape. The hunched posture, the shaggy hair, the size of it. She looked at it, and I could tell she didn't believe me. She said something like, "Bigfoot? That's up in Canada, not here." Other people chimed in, laughing it off, saying I must have seen a bear or just let my imagination get the best of me. But I knew what I saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't smell like that, and they don't move like that. This thing was different. The rest of the day was a blur. I went back to my dorm, but I couldn't sit still. Every noise made me jump. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the way it moved, the smell, the fear. I didn't sleep well that night, and for weeks after, I avoided going out alone. Even now, all these years later, I get goosebumps thinking about it. I never went back to that corral, and I've stayed away from remote areas ever since. It's like that encounter left a mark on me, and I can't shake the feeling that something was out there, something I can't explain. Story 15. I still can't believe I'm writing this down. For years, I've kept it to myself, mostly because I thought people would laugh or think I'd lost my mind after the divorce. But lately, it's been eating at me, and I need to get it out. So here goes. It was back in the early 2000s, I think, maybe 2003 or 4. I'd just gone through a messy divorce, and my sister, God bless her, suggested we take a trip to get my mind off things. She'd always been the adventurous one, and she found this little village in rural France through some friend of a friend. It was supposed to be this peaceful, off-the-grid kind of place, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, the kind of spot you see in postcards, but never actually visit. We stayed with a local host in a small guest house on the edge of the village. The host was this older guy, kind of gruff but friendly enough, and he warned us about wandering too far into the woods. He said something about it being un endroit particulier, a particular place, and that locals avoided it after dark. At the time, I brushed it off. I mean, I was from the suburbs. What did I know about forests? I figured it was just superstition or maybe concerns about wild boars or something. The day it happened started out perfectly normal. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air smells like damp leaves and wood smoke. My sister and I had breakfast with the host, just some bread, cheese and coffee, and he repeated his warning, telling us to stick to the marked paths if we went hiking. I remember feeling a bit restless. The divorce had left me raw, like my nerves were all exposed, and I needed to clear my head. My sister wanted to explore the village market, but I decided to go for a walk alone. I told her I'd be back in a couple of hours, and she seemed fine with it, probably thinking it'd do me good. I set off around mid-morning, wearing my comfortable jeans, a thick sweater and sturdy boots. Nothing fancy, just stuff I'd packed for the trip. The path into the woods was well trodden at first, lined with tall, ancient-looking trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I've always loved nature, but this felt different. It was heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I kept walking, following the path as it narrowed and twisted deeper into the trees. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and every step made a crunching sound that seemed way too loud in the stillness. After about an hour, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a prickling on the back of my neck like someone was watching me. I stopped a few times to look around, but I didn't see anything. The woods were dense, with thick underbrush and shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination or the stress from the divorce messing with me. But then I started hearing things. Not loud noises, just little rustles in the bushes off to my left. At first, I thought it might be a squirrel or a bird, but the sounds were too deliberate, like something was moving slowly, keeping pace with me. My heart started beating faster, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cool air. I decided to turn back, but when I looked behind me, the path didn't look the same. It's hard to explain. Everything seemed shifted, like the trees had closed in. I pulled out my water bottle and took a sip, trying to calm down. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl from somewhere up ahead. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, rumbling, and it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a second, I thought maybe it was a bear, but we were in France. I didn't think they had bears in that area. The host had mentioned boars, but this sounded bigger, way bigger. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening. The growl didn't come again, but now I could hear other sounds, heavy footsteps crunching through the undergrowth like something big was moving around. My legs felt like jelly, and I had this overwhelming urge to run, but I was too scared to move. I remember clutching my sweater tighter, my knuckles turning white. The air started to smell weird too, musty and earthy, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. It was faint at first, but it got stronger, making my stomach churn. I forced myself to take a few steps forward, thinking I could find a clearer spot, or maybe see what was making the noise. Bad idea. As I rounded a bend in the path, I saw them. Two yellow eyes glowing from the shadows between the trees. They were high up, way higher than any animal's eyes should be, and they were just staring right at me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. Those eyes weren't blinking. They were fixed on me, unblinking and intense. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, so hard it hurt. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't even scream. I just stood there, paralyzed. Then the thing stepped out into a patch of dim light. I swear I've never been so terrified in my life. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, shaggy hair that looked matted and dirty. Its arms were long and muscular, hanging down almost to its knees, and it moved with a strange, fluid grace that didn't match its size. But the worst part was its face. It was almost human-like, but twisted, with a heavy brow and those piercing yellow eyes. It didn't make a sound at first, just stood there watching me. I could see its chest rising and falling with each breath, and the smell hit me full force now, that same dirty, sweaty odor, but stronger, like a skunk had died and been left out in the rain. I don't know how long we stared at each other, maybe 10 seconds, maybe a minute, but it felt like an eternity. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bigfoot, in France. It sounded insane, but there it was. Then it let out this roar that I'll never forget. It wasn't just loud, it was visceral, like it vibrated through my whole body. It started low and built into this deafening bellow that sounded part lion, part something prehistoric, and part angry human. The sound echoed through the trees, and I felt it in my bones, a deep thrum that made my teeth chatter. At the same time, it slammed one of its massive hands against a nearby tree trunk, and the impact was so powerful that the tree shook, and I heard wood splintering. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on my butt. The pain shot up my spine, but I barely registered it, because the thing took a step toward me. Its eyes never left mine, and I could see intelligence in them, something predatory and ancient. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking so bad I almost fell again. I turned and ran, not caring about the path anymore, just desperate to get away. Branches whipped at my face and arms, scratching me, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the brush. And that roar came again, followed by more tree banging, like it was pounding on the trunks with its fists. Each bang was like a thunderclap, and I could feel the ground tremble under my feet. I don't know how I found my way back. It was all a blur of panic and fear. I just ran in the direction I thought was right, my lungs burning, my throat raw from gasping for air. When I finally burst out of the trees and saw the guest house in the distance, I almost collapsed with relief. I sprinted the rest of the way, my clothes torn and covered in dirt, my face streaked with tears and sweat. My sister was outside talking to the host, and when she saw me, her eyes went wide. "What happened?" she asked, rushing over. I was shaking so hard I could barely speak. I just blurted it out. Everything, from the yellow eyes to the roar to the thing in the woods. The host's face went from concern to angry in seconds. He started yelling in French, something I couldn't fully understand, but I caught words like fou and interdit, crazy and forbidden. He was furious, pointing back at the woods and shaking his head. My sister tried to calm him down, but he just kept shouting, his face red. Finally, he told us we had to leave. Right then, he said we'd brought trouble, and he didn't want us there anymore. We packed our bags in a daze, and he drove us to the nearest town without another word. The whole ride, I sat in the back seat trembling, replaying it all in my head. The terror of that roar, the feeling of being stalked, the sheer size of that creature. It was burned into my memory. We found a hotel and stayed the night, but I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow eyes. I never spoke about it again until now. Not to my sister, not to anyone. She tried to ask me about it a few times, but I just changed the subject. I think she thought I'd had a breakdown or something, and maybe I did. But I know what I saw. Whatever it wasn't human. And it wasn't any animal I've ever heard of. To this day, I can't explain it, and the fear still lingers, like a shadow I can't shake. Story 16. It was the first day of bow season in 2004. I remember because it was a Saturday, and I'd been looking forward to it for months. I was hunting alone, which wasn't unusual for me. I liked the quiet. I was way out in the Ozarks, in the southwest corner of Taney County, right near where it bumps up against Stone County and the Arkansas border. My spot was east of Highway 65, a good mile or so in. It's rough country out there, not many people. I'd left my truck before sunrise, walking in with a headlamp, the air cool and damp. I was headed for a specific spot I'd scouted the winter before. It's where three hills kind of come together, and between them is this deep, thick creek bed. I called it the bottleneck. It was a natural funnel. Deer would move through there to get from one ridge to the next without having to go up and over. It was a perfect spot, or so I thought. I got my stand set up in a big oak tree overlooking the bottleneck. It was one of those climbing stands, and I remember the metal bits were cold and my fingers were a little stiff. The sun started to come up, and the woods went from black to grey to this soft, greenish light. Everything was quiet, the kind of deep quiet you only get way out in the woods. You could hear the leaves rustling as they fell, one by one. I'd been sitting for maybe an hour, just watching. I saw a few squirrels, and then, right around 7:30, I saw a decent buck. He was moving through the timber on the far hill, heading down toward the creek bed. My heart started beating a little faster. This was it. I got my bow ready, my release hooked onto the string. I was focused, my whole world narrowed down to that deer and the path he was walking. He was going to come right through the bottleneck, right into my shooting lane. That's when I heard it. It wasn't the deer. The sound came from behind me and to my left. It was a heavy, steady crunching, not the light, careful steps of a deer. This was something big, moving through the dry leaves and snapping small branches. It was coming closer. My first thought was, another hunter? But it was too loud, too careless. and it was moving through some really thick stuff, the kind of place a person would try to go around. I remember feeling a spike of annoyance. Honestly, someone was about to ruin my hunt. I slowly turned my head, trying to see through the dense undergrowth. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it, clear as day. It was close, maybe 30, 40 yards. I shifted my weight in the stand, turning my whole body as slowly as I could, the metal seat creaking just a little. I was no longer thinking about the buck. This new thing had my full attention. I had my bow in my hand, an arrow nocked, but my finger was off the release. I was just listening, trying to figure out what it was. A bear? We have black bears in Missouri, but they're usually pretty shy. This thing sounded purposeful. It wasn't running, but it wasn't sneaking either. It was just walking like it owned the place. Then it stopped. The woods went dead silent again. The crunching just ceased. It had stopped moving. I held my breath, my ears straining. Nothing. For a good 30 seconds there was nothing. It was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. I was staring into the wall of green, my eyes trying to pick out a shape, a color, anything that didn't belong. That's when the crows went nuts. A flock of them, maybe 10 or 12, had been hanging around in the tops of some tall pines a couple 100 yards away. All of a sudden, they just erupted. It wasn't their normal cawing. This was a panic, a frenzy. They were screaming and diving, swirling in the air right over one spot, the spot where the sound had stopped. They were going absolutely insane over something I couldn't see. It was like they were trying to attack it or drive it away. A cold feeling started in my gut, a kind of dread that had nothing to do with a deer or another hunter. This was different. The crows were focused on something on the ground, something hidden in the thicket. My mind was racing. A coyote, a bobcat. But the crows wouldn't react like that. They'd just fly away. This was an aggressive, terrified reaction. Then the thing bolted. It didn't start walking again. It just exploded out of that spot. The sound was unbelievable. It wasn't the light, quick crashing of a deer. This was a heavy, powerful, violent crashing. It was smashing through stuff, not going around it, not jumping over it. It was plowing through saplings and brush. I heard branches, real branches, the kind as thick as your wrist, snapping. Not little twigs, big, solid cracks. It sounded like a truck was driving through the woods. My jaw literally dropped. I was frozen, just listening to this thing tear through the forest. It was moving away from me, down the hill, and the sound was so loud and heavy, it was shaking the leaves on the trees around me. It was only 25 yards away, maybe less. I still couldn't see it. The vegetation was too thick, but I could feel the vibrations from its footsteps through the tree I was in. It was that heavy. It moved maybe 50 yards down into the bottleneck, and then it stopped again. The crashing stopped dead. The crows scattered and went quiet. The woods were silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a waiting silence, a held breath silence, and then it yelled. It's hard to describe a sound like that. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't a scream, it was a yell. A deep, powerful, guttural yell that came from a chest bigger than any man's. It was so loud it didn't just hit my ears, it hit my whole body. I felt it in my bones. My clothes actually vibrated against my skin from the force of it. The sound seemed to suck all the other noise out of the world. It was pure, raw power. My brain short-circuited. The word Bigfoot didn't form in my mind as a thought. It was an instinct, a primal, immediate label that my survival brain slapped onto that sound. It was the only thing that could possibly make a sound like that. In that single moment, any doubt I'd ever had about those stories just vanished. This was real. The fear that hit me was physical. It wasn't just being scared. It was a total system shutdown. My blood went cold. My fingers, which were holding my bow, went numb. I felt a warmth spread in my pants as I lost control of my bladder. I didn't even realize it had happened until later. I was just frozen, solid. My body rigid with a terror so complete I couldn't even breathe. And then, as if that first yell was a signal, the woods erupted. From the other hills, from the distance, other calls came back. Not one, not two, several. They were answering. Some were a little higher pitched, some were just as deep. They were all around me. The sounds were echoing through the hills, bouncing around the bottleneck. It was a chorus, a terrifying, impossible chorus. It sounded like something from a movie, like Jurassic Park, but it was real and I was right in the middle of it. The woods, which had been so quiet and peaceful just minutes before, were now alive with this communication. They were talking to each other, and I was the topic of conversation. That was the most terrifying part. Realizing I wasn't dealing with one of them, I was surrounded. My survival instinct finally overrode the paralysis. I had to get out. I wasn't thinking about my bow or my stand or the $100 worth of gear I had with me. I was thinking about getting back to my truck alive. Moving was the hardest thing I've ever done. I was 15 feet up a tree, shaking so bad I was afraid I'd fall. I had to get my stand down. I remember fumbling with the straps, my fingers slick with sweat and completely useless. Every sound I made, the clink of a carabiner, the scrape of the stand on the bark, sounded like a gunshot to me. I was convinced they could hear me, that they were coming. I kept looking down, expecting to see one of them standing at the base of my tree, looking up at me. The image in my head was clear, tall, covered in dark hair, just staring. Somehow I got the stand loose and started lowering myself down. It felt like it took an hour. When my feet hit the ground, my legs were so weak I almost collapsed. I left my stand there. I just let it drop. I didn't care. I had my bow in one hand, and that was it. I started backing away. I didn't turn my back on the bottleneck. I walked backwards, step by careful step, my eyes glued to the wall of trees where the sounds had come from. I was moving as quietly as I could, but every leaf I stepped on sounded like a drum. I was waiting for another yell, for the crashing to start again, this time coming toward me. I backed up for what felt like a mile, but it was probably only a couple 100 yards. Once I was over the crest of the hill behind me, I finally turned around and started to half walk, half run. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just moved, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I got to my truck, fumbled the keys, and got the hell out of there. I drove straight home, white-knuckling the steering wheel the whole way. I didn't stop for gas. I didn't stop for coffee. I just drove. I never went back to that spot. Not to get my stand, not to scout, not for anything. I told my wife I'd had a bad experience with a bear and didn't want to hunt there anymore. It was easier than the truth. I've spent years turning it over in my head. A bear doesn't make a sound like that. A bear doesn't get answered by other bears from different hills. A person playing a prank out there with that kind of power, no way, it was them. I don't know what else to call them. I heard them. I felt that yell in my chest. It's been almost 20 years, and I can still hear it, clear as day, if I let myself think about it. It's the one experience in my life I have absolutely no explanation for. And it scared me so bad that a part of me is still frozen in that tree, listening to the woods come alive with a sound that shouldn't exist. Story 17. It was the last day of our camping trip, a Sunday in late September. The air had that crisp, clean smell that you only get way out in the woods, a mix of pine needles and cold dirt. We'd spent the weekend near Mount St. Helens, just me, my husband, and our 2 kids. The weekend had been perfect, the kind of perfect you try to hold on to in your memory during the long grey winter. We'd had a campfire, made s'mores, the kids had run themselves ragged exploring. Now we were all tired and quiet, just ready to be home. The drive started out normal. So normal it's almost boring to think about now. The kids were in the back seat. My son, who's 10, was already dozing against the window, his mouth slightly open. My daughter, 7, was fighting sleep, her eyelids heavy as she stared out at the blur of trees. My husband was in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone, probably checking work emails already, the blue light from the screen lighting up his face in the dim car. I was driving, my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel of our SUV, just following the winding road that would eventually lead us back to the interstate. The road was one of those two-lane Forest Service roads, paved but narrow, with no shoulder to speak of. On one side, a steep slope covered in ferns and salal bushes rose up towards the sky. On the other, a sharp drop-off was barely held back by an old, weathered wooden guardrail. Beyond that, just a sea of dark green trees, so thick you couldn't see more than 20 feet into them. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, deep shadows across the asphalt. It was that time of late afternoon where everything feels still and quiet, like the world is holding its breath. I was just driving, my mind already halfway home, thinking about unpacking, about the laundry, about whether we had anything for dinner. I was maybe going 5 miles under the speed limit, just being cautious on the curves. The road curved to the left around a big outcropping of rock covered in moss. As I started to turn the wheel, something moved at the edge of my vision. From the trees on the right side of the road, the side with the drop-off. My first thought, my brain's automatic rational filing system, was deer, a big buck. You see them all the time out here, especially around dusk. But in the split second it took for my eyes to focus, my brain just stuttered. It wasn't the right shape. It was too tall, too upright. Then it stepped out onto the road. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a weird fur coat. I have to keep saying that to myself, even now, because my mind still wants to find a box to put it in. But there isn't one. It was huge. I'm not good at estimating heights, but it had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in hair, but not like a bear's fur. This was long, shaggy, a dark, wet-looking brown, almost black in the shadows. It was built powerfully. That's the only word. Its shoulders were massive, rounded and heavy, and its arms were long, swinging slightly as it walked. They weren't gangly like a person's. They were thick and solid like tree limbs. It took 2, maybe 3 slow, deliberate steps from the edge of the forest, right into the center of our lane. I didn't even have time to think. My body reacted before my brain did. I slammed my foot down on the brake pedal hard. The tires screeched, and the whole SUV lurched forward, throwing us all against our seatbelts. There was a chorus of grunts and a yelp from the back seat as the kids were jolted awake. My husband's phone flew out of his hand and clattered into the footwell. And then there was silence, a dead, heavy silence, broken only by the tick, tick, tick of the cooling engine. We were stopped, maybe 15, 20 feet from it. It was right there, in the middle of the road. It didn't look at us. It didn't react to the squealing tires or the car at all. It just kept walking. Its gait was strange, not a lumber, not a stroll, but a smooth, ground-eating walk that seemed effortless. It moved across the pavement with a purpose, like it was just crossing a street it crossed every day. I could see the muscles moving under that dark, matted hair on its back and legs. I could see how its feet, which were large and dark, almost like a person's but wider, flatter, pressed into the asphalt. The smell hit me then. I had the driver's side window cracked open a couple of inches for fresh air. It came in through that crack, a wave of scent so strong and foul it made my eyes water. It was a thick, heavy smell, like a mix of wet dog, rotten meat and old, dank earth. It was the smell of something wild and unclean, a smell that belonged deep in the woods, not here on a man-made road. My hands were locked on the steering wheel. I could feel the hard, textured plastic under my palms, and I could feel a violent, fine tremor running through my fingers and up my arms. My heart wasn't just beating fast, it was slamming against my ribs, a frantic, painful drumming. I couldn't look away. I was frozen, just watching this thing complete its walk across the road. It reached the other side, the side with the steep slope. The guardrail there was about waist high on a man. This creature didn't even break stride. It just lifted one of those long, powerful legs and stepped over it. like you or I would step over a crack in the sidewalk. It didn't climb, it didn't vault, it just stepped. And then it was gone. It melted into the wall of ferns and salal and trees, and the forest just swallowed it up. 1 second it was there, a solid, undeniable mass, and the next there was nothing but the shaking leaves of a few ferns to show where it had been. The silence in the car was absolute. I could hear my own blood roaring in my ears. I could hear my daughter's shallow, frightened breathing from the back seat. I was still staring at the spot where it had disappeared, my brain screaming at me that it was impossible, that I hadn't just seen that. Then, from the passenger seat, my husband's voice, low and tight, almost a whisper. "Did you see that?" It wasn't a question of surprise. It was a question of confirmation, a desperate need to know he wasn't losing his mind. I couldn't speak. My throat was clenched shut. I just managed a jerky nod, my eyes still glued to the empty road. "I saw it," my son said from the back, his voice small and thin. "I saw the monster." That word, monster, broke the spell. It was so simple, so direct. That's what it was. There was no other word for it. My husband turned in his seat to look at the kids, then back at me. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He looked the way I felt, scared down to his bones. "What the hell was that?" he asked. But it wasn't really a question for me. It was just the only thing his brain could form. I finally managed to unclench my hands from the wheel. My fingers ached. I looked down at them and they were still shaking. I put the car in park. We weren't moving, but it felt like the right thing to do to make sure we were truly stopped. The logical part of my brain was starting to flicker back online, but it was short-circuiting. Bear? No, the proportions were all wrong. Bears don't walk fully upright like that, not for more than a step or two. Their shoulders are built different. This thing's back was straight, a person. No one is that tall, that broad, and covered head to toe in what was unmistakably hair, not clothing. And the smell, no person smells like that. The awe came then, mixed with the terror. It was a cold, dizzying feeling. It was the realization that the world was not the safe, mapped, explained place I thought it was. There were still blank spots on the map, and things lived in those blank spots that we weren't supposed to see. We had just seen one. We had looked right at it. "Did it look at us?" I asked, my voice raspy. My husband shook his head slowly. "No, it didn't even seem to notice we were here." That was almost scarier, the sheer indifference. We were in a 2-ton metal vehicle that had just made a huge noise, and it hadn't even glanced our way. We were irrelevant, flies on a windshield. We sat there for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a minute or two. No other cars came. We were alone on that road, alone with what we had just witnessed. The shadows were getting longer, the light turning a deeper gold. It was still beautiful, but the beauty felt sinister now. The woods weren't a peaceful place anymore. They were a hiding place. "We need to go," my husband said quietly. I nodded. I put the car back in drive. My foot was still unsteady on the pedal, and the car jerked a little as we started moving again. As we drove past the spot where it had crossed, I slowed down. I looked at the guardrail it had stepped over so easily. I looked into the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the deep, impenetrable green. We drove the rest of the way to the interstate in near silence. The kids were wide awake now, huddled together in the back. No one spoke. The radio was off. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the pavement. Every shadow between the trees looked like a moving shape. Every dark stump on the side of the road made my heart jump. We got home. We unpacked the car like robots. We put the kids to bed, and they didn't even argue. They just went clinging to their stuffed animals a little tighter than usual. My husband and I sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea we didn't drink. We talked about it in low voices, going over every detail, trying to make it make sense. The height, the hair, the walk, the smell, the way it stepped over the guardrail. We weren't trying to convince each other. We were both there. We were trying to cement it in reality, to prove to ourselves that it had really happened. And that's the thing that has stuck with me. More than the fear, more than the awe, it's the absolute certainty. There is not a single doubt in my mind about what we saw. I wasn't tired. I wasn't hallucinating. All four of us saw the same thing. We saw something that shouldn't exist, walking calmly across a road in Washington state, as if it had every right to be there. It changed something fundamental in me. I look out my window now at the line of trees at the back of our suburban yard, and I don't just see trees. I see a veil, I see a border, and I know with a cold, hard certainty that on the other side of that border, things are moving in the shadows that we can't even imagine. We caught a glimpse through a tear in the fabric that day, and the world has never looked the same since. I don't talk about it with people. Who would believe it? But sometimes, late at night, I'll catch my husband just staring out the window into the darkness. And I know he's thinking about it too. We saw it, and we can never unsee it. Story 18. I've never told this to anyone outside my family, and even then, not the whole of it. Most folks would think I'd lost my mind or was spinning a tall tale to get attention. But I'm an old man now, and the weight of this, it's time I set it down somewhere. I don't expect you to believe me. I hardly believe it myself. And I was there. It was the spring of 1864. Me and my two older brothers, we'd caught the fever. Not for gold, but for copper. We'd heard the rumors, stories from trappers about a vein of it, pure and easy to get at, up in the mountains near Grizzly Lake, just a stone's throw from Mount St. Helens. We were young, strong, and stupid with ambition. We figured we'd stake a claim, work it for a season or two, and come out set for life. The journey in was hard, but it was a good hard. The kind that makes you feel alive. The air was so clean it hurt your lungs, and the trees were so big they made you feel like an insect. We found our spot on the south shore of the lake. The water was dark, like black tea, and so still it reflected the mountain perfectly, like a second upside-down world. It was beautiful, but even then, in all that sunshine, there was a quietness to the place that felt heavy. We just chalked it up to the wilderness being wilderness. We built a cabin. It wasn't much, just a single room of rough-hewn logs, a stone fireplace, a door that never quite hung straight. We chinked the gaps with moss and mud. It felt like a real accomplishment, a little piece of our own civilization carved out of all that endless green. We worked the claim through the summer and into the fall. The work was backbreaking, but we were finding copper. It was real. Our dream was coming true. Then came the first snow. We hadn't planned on wintering over, but the season had been better than we'd hoped. We decided one of us should stay, to hold the claim and keep working the diggings as long as the weather allowed. My oldest brother, he volunteered. He was the toughest of us, a man of few words who could outwork a mule. We stocked the cabin with as much smoked meat, flour, and coffee as we could, promised we'd be back as soon as the snows melted in the spring, and started the long trek out. The winter was a bad one. Deep snows kept us valley-bound for weeks longer than we'd planned. By the time the trails were passable, it was late spring. My other brother and I, we were fairly buzzing with excitement, talking about the fortune we were going to make, how proud our oldest brother would be of the work he'd done alone all winter. The silence was the first thing that hit us when we got to the lake. It's never truly silent in the woods. There's always the wind or birds or something rustling in the undergrowth. This was a dead quiet, the kind that presses in on your ears. The cabin was there, looking just as we'd left it, but the smoke hole was cold. No smoke, no smell of a fire. We called out his name. Our voices just got swallowed up by the trees. No answer. The door was latched from the outside, which was strange. He'd have had no reason to do that if he was inside. My heart was starting to thump against my ribs, a slow, heavy beat of dread. I unlatched it and pushed the door open. The inside was a tomb, cold and still. A fine layer of dust covered everything. The bed was neatly made. A pot sat cold in the fireplace. It was like he'd just stepped out for a minute, months ago, but he hadn't. His pack was gone. His good rifle was gone from its pegs above the fireplace. We searched that cabin top to bottom. It was my brother who found it, tucked under a corner of the mattress, his diary. It was just a small, leather-bound book. He used to keep tallies and notes. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely open it. The first few pages were normal, tallies of ore, notes on the weather, complaints about the cold. Then about halfway through the winter, the entries changed. The handwriting, usually so neat and steady, became scrawled, hurried. He wrote about the noises first, not the normal sounds of the forest. He called it a whooping sound, way off in the trees, something that didn't belong to any wolf or owl he'd ever heard. Then he wrote about feeling watched. Not a casual feeling, but a constant prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like eyes were on him every time he stepped outside the cabin. The entries got shorter, more frantic. He wrote about finding footprints in the snow, massive footprints bigger than a grizzly's, but shaped like a man's. He drew a rough sketch in the margin. I stared at that drawing, my blood running cold. It was a long foot with 5 toes, but it was wrong. The proportions were off. The last few entries were the worst. He wrote about seeing it. He never gave it a name. He just called it the hairy man, or the thing. He said it was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, covered in dark, shaggy hair. It would stand at the tree line, just watching the cabin. He said the smell came with it, a foul, musky stench like rotten meat and wet dog, so strong it made his eyes water even from a distance. The final entry was just 2 sentences, the ink blotted as if his hand was shaking. It's circling the cabin at night. I can't stay here. And that was it. He was gone. We were devastated. We searched for days. We found his trail, leading away from the cabin toward the higher ridges. We followed it until it just stopped, as if he'd been plucked from the earth. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing. It was like the forest had just opened up and swallowed him whole. We were broken men, but the claim was still there, the copper was still there, and maybe some stubborn, stupid part of us didn't want to let the mountain win. We decided we couldn't just leave. We'd work the claim for 1 more season, for him, but we'd be smarter, we'd be more careful. We reinforced the cabin. We put heavy wooden bars on the inside of the door. We kept a fire burning low all night. We never went out alone, and never went far from the cabin without a rifle in our hands. The whole summer, the feeling of being watched never left me. It was a constant, low-grade hum of fear under my skin. We'd hear things too, rocks clacking together up in the scree slopes. The occasional deep, guttural grunt that echoed through the trees. We'd convince ourselves it was a bear. We had to. The alternative was unthinkable. Summer turned to fall. The days got shorter, the nights colder. The dread started to set in again, thick and heavy as river mud. We'd agreed one of us would have to stay again to hold the claim. My other brother, he insisted it was his turn. He said he wasn't afraid. I think we both knew he was lying. I didn't want to leave him. The memory of finding that empty cabin was burned into my mind. But he was stubborn. So, with a heart full of lead, I left him there as the first snowflakes began to fall. I remember the look on his face as I walked away. He tried to give me a brave smile, but his eyes were scared. I can still see those eyes. That winter was the longest of my life. Every creak of the house, every moan of the wind made me jump. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, imagining him out there in that tiny cabin, surrounded by the dark and the cold and the silence. As soon as the snow receded enough, I went back. I didn't wait for a full thaw. I practically ran the whole way, my pack feeling like it was full of stones. I was so scared of what I'd find, and so desperate to find my brother alive, that I was sick to my stomach the whole time. I broke through the last of the trees and saw the cabin. The door was gone, not open, gone, torn clean off its leather hinges. One of the hinges was just ripped in half. The wood around it splintered into sharp, white spears. I froze. My legs just wouldn't move. I stood there for what felt like an hour, just staring at that dark, open doorway. It looked like a mouth. I finally forced myself to move forward, my rifle so slick in my sweaty hands I could barely hold it. The smell hit me first. That smell, the one from the diary. Rotten meat and wet dog. It was faint, but it was there, lingering in the air like a poison. The inside of the cabin was a wreck. The table was smashed to kindling. The bed was overturned. Our supplies were scattered everywhere, cans crushed, flour sacks torn open, and there was blood. Dark, rusty brown smears on the floorboards, on the walls. Not a lot, but enough. My brother was gone. I started screaming his name, my voice cracking with panic. I ran outside, circling the cabin, my eyes scanning the ground frantically, and I saw them. The footprints, just like the drawing in the diary, huge man-like tracks pressed deep into the half-frozen mud. They led from the cabin door, around the side, and then off into the trees. I followed them. I don't know what I was thinking. I was just acting, a raw nerve of fear and grief. The tracks were easy to follow, pressed deep. They led me a few hundred yards into the woods to a small, rocky clearing, and then they just stopped. There was nothing, no body, no more tracks, no sign of a struggle. It was exactly like with our oldest brother, as if whatever had taken him had just vanished into thin air. I stood there in that clearing, the silence pressing down on me. The only sound was the blood roaring in my ears. I looked down at those last perfect footprints, and then I looked up at the trees surrounding me. That's when I felt it, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a prickle this time. It was a physical weight, a pressure. Something was in the trees, just beyond my sight. I could feel its presence like a cold draft. I slowly raised my rifle, my arms trembling so violently the sights were jumping all over the place. I scanned the tree line, my breath coming in ragged white puffs. I saw nothing but shadows and branches. Then I heard it, a low, deep sound. It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a roar. It was a hum, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was so low I felt it in my teeth, in the bones of my skull. It was the most terrifying sound I have ever heard. It wasn't an animal sound, it was intelligent. It was a sound of possession, a sound that said, "This is my place." That sound broke something in me. The last bit of courage or stupidity or whatever had been holding me together just shattered. I wasn't a hunter anymore. I was prey. I turned and I ran. I didn't look back. I crashed through the undergrowth, stumbling over roots, branches whipping my face. I didn't stop running until my lungs were on fire and my legs gave out. I collapsed, vomiting into the dirt, sobbing with a terror so complete it felt like I was dying. I never went back. I left everything, the cabin, the tools, the copper claim. I walked out of those mountains and I kept walking. I never told anyone the full story. Who would believe that my brothers were taken by a thing? A hairy man that left no trace? I'm an old man now. I've lived a long life, but I've never spent another night in the deep woods. I still dream about it. The silence of the cabin, the splintered door, those footprints and that sound, that low, humming vibration that promised nothing but a cold, dark end. I lost my brothers to that mountain, to something that lives in the shadows between the trees, something that doesn't belong in any book or story. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. All I know is that it's still out there, and some places, some wild, dark places, just aren't meant for men. Story 19. It was one of those Saturdays at Lake Shasta that just felt off. I've been camping in California my whole life. My dad had me in a sleeping bag before I could walk. So I know the normal sounds. The rustle of a raccoon in the bushes, the scurry of a squirrel, the heavy four-legged plod of a black bear. This wasn't any of that. This was different from the very first second. and I knew it. The fire was dying. That's where I was, just sitting on an old log I'd dragged over, poking at the embers with a stick. The flames had died down to a deep orange pulse, and the air was getting that late-night chill that sinks right into your bones. It was so quiet, unnaturally quiet. That was the first weird thing. Usually, even at night, you hear things. Crickets, the lake lapping at the shore. Something. But tonight, it was like someone had thrown a soundproof blanket over our whole little campsite. It was just me, the pop and crackle of the cooling fire, and this heavy, pressing silence all around. Then it happened. A loud crack. It wasn't a small sound. It wasn't a twig snapping under a deer's hoof. This was a branch, a thick one. It came from maybe 50 yards away, deep in the trees on the other side of the clearing from our camper. The sound was so abrupt, so sharp, it felt like a gunshot in the silence. It didn't creak and then break, it just snapped, clean, like something just stepped on it. My whole body went rigid. I stopped breathing for a second, my hand frozen mid-poke over the fire. I stared into the wall of blackness where the sound came from. I couldn't see a thing. It was one of those pitch-black nights where there's no moon and the tree canopy just eats any starlight. My eyes were useless, so I just listened. My ears were straining so hard they were practically buzzing. Nothing. For 10 whole minutes, there was nothing. Just that same heavy, waiting silence. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, scared animal rhythm. I tried to tell myself it was a bear, a big one, a bear breaking a branch. That's normal, but it didn't feel normal. A bear would have made more noise afterwards. It would have shuffled, grunted, maybe knocked into another tree. There was nothing, just that one violent snap and then a void of sound that was somehow louder and more terrifying. Then another snap. This one was closer, a lot closer. My brain instantly measured the distance. 35 yards maybe. It was the same kind of sound, a dry, powerful break, no give, no warning. And again there was no sound of the branch falling, no rustle of it hitting the ground. It was like whatever broke it caught it or just kept it from falling. My throat went dry. This wasn't right, this wasn't how the forest worked. I was still sitting there, paralyzed, trying to peer into the absolute darkness, when I heard the footsteps. They started slow, heavy, thud. A pause. Thud. Another pause. They weren't the quick, light steps of a deer. They weren't the clumsy, four-footed gait of a bear. These were footsteps. Bipedal. Something walking on two legs. And the strides, they were long, really long. I could hear the distance between each footfall. It was a slow, deliberate, crushing weight. Thud. Pause. Thud. Pause. I counted them, I don't know why. My brain was just latching onto anything to make sense of it. 10, 11, 12, 13, heavy, slow, earth-pressing steps, all coming directly toward me, toward the fire. The sound was getting clearer with each one, which meant it was getting closer. The fear at that point wasn't even a feeling anymore. It was a physical substance that had replaced the blood in my veins. It was cold and thick, and it made my fingers tremble where they were gripping my knees. Another snap. This one was so close it made me flinch backwards on the log. 10 yards, maybe less. Right at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the ring of faint orange light from my dying fire. That's when I broke. I couldn't be alone with this anymore. I scrambled up, my legs wobbly and weak, and practically fell into the camper. My buddy was crashed out on the bunk, snoring lightly. I shook him awake, probably harder than I needed to. Dude, wake up, I whispered, my voice tight and shaky. There's something out there. He grumbled, half asleep, but he saw the look on my face. I must have been white as a sheet. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. What? A bear? I don't know, just listen. We both went quiet, standing there in the dark camper, the door still open a crack. For a moment there was nothing. Then we heard it together. Another one of those heavy, slow footsteps. Thud. It was so close now. It was just outside, right there in the darkness beyond the fire. My buddy's face changed. The sleepiness vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed confusion that quickly bled into fear. He heard it too. He heard how wrong it was. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me, looked out the door into the blackness, and then he backed away. He retreated to the far end of the camper and sat down on the floor, pulling his knees up to his chest. He was done. He left me there by the door, and I was alone again. I stood there holding the edge of the doorframe, my knuckles white. I was listening so hard I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. The footsteps had stopped, the snapping had stopped, but the presence hadn't left. I could feel it. It's hard to explain, but you know when someone is standing near you, even if you can't see them. It was like that, but magnified by 1,000. It was a pressure in the air, a feeling of being watched by something massive, something that knew exactly where I was. I couldn't see anything. The fire was just a pool of faint, glowing embers now, casting a light that only reached a few feet. Beyond that, it was just a solid wall of night. But I knew it was there. It was standing just outside the light, hidden among the trees. I could feel its attention on me, a focused, intelligent attention. It wasn't the dumb curiosity of an animal. This was different. My mind was racing, trying to fit this into a box I understood. A bear? No, absolutely not. I've been too close to bears before. They don't walk like that. Their footsteps are quicker, closer together, and they're noisy. They knock things over. They snort. They don't take these long, slow, deliberate, upright steps, and they don't just stand in one place, hidden for this long. A person in this remote part of the lake at this hour, walking through thick forest with that kind of crushing weight. It made no sense. That's when the smell hit me. It's a detail I'll never forget. One of those specific things you only know if you were there. It came on the breeze, a sudden foul wave. It was a mix of things, like a wet dog, but stronger, muskier, and underneath it, this sickening sweetness, like rotten meat and old blood. It was overwhelming. It made my stomach turn. I'd never smelled anything like it in these woods, not ever. It just cemented it. This was nothing I had ever encountered. I was armed, but not with a gun. I was armed with knowledge, a lifetime of camping, of knowing these woods, of understanding the behavior of everything in them, and that knowledge was screaming at me that whatever this was, it wasn't on any list of local fauna. It was something else, and that realization was more terrifying than any bear charge. A bear, you know what to do. You make yourself big, you make noise, you back away. This, I had no protocol. I was completely, utterly vulnerable because I had no idea what I was dealing with. The terror was a live wire in my chest. It was a cold sweat on my back and a tightness in my throat that made it hard to swallow. My breathing was shallow, little panicked puffs of air. I was afraid to move, afraid that any sound I made would provoke it. So I just stood there, frozen by the door, staring into the impenetrable dark, listening to the silence that was now filled with this horrible, unseen presence. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like an hour, but it was probably only a few minutes. The smell began to fade, slowly, carried away on a slight shift in the wind. The feeling of being watched, it lessened, not all at once, but gradually, like a weight being lifted. The forest didn't suddenly come back to life. The silence remained, but the specific, focused pressure of the thing was gone. It had left. I finally forced myself to take a step back and quietly, so quietly, closed the camper door and locked it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat on the floor, my back against the door, listening. My buddy eventually fell back asleep, his breathing evening out, completely oblivious now that the immediate danger seemed to have passed. But I couldn't. Every little sound, the creak of the camper, the rustle of a leaf against the window, made me jump. When the sun finally started to come up, turning the sky a pale grey, I felt a relief so profound it was almost painful. I waited until it was fully light, until I could see clearly before I dared to open the door. The campsite was just as we'd left it. the dead fire, the log I'd been sitting on, our chairs. Everything was normal. I walked over to the tree line, to where I'd heard that last branch snap from just 10 yards away. My heart was in my throat again. I was half expecting to see, I don't know what. Tracks, maybe. Something. And I did see something. There, in the soft, damp earth, was a footprint. Just one. It was huge, longer than my boot by a good 6 inches and wide. It was a vague, almost human-like shape. But the toes, if they were toes, they were splayed out. And the whole thing was just so much bigger than any man's print I'd ever seen. And a few feet away, lying on a bed of ferns, was the branch. It was thick, about the size of my forearm, and it was snapped clean in two, the break fresh and white against the brown bark. I just stood there, looking from the footprint to the broken branch and back again. My knowledge of the woods, the thing I'd always relied on, had failed me. It couldn't explain what had been out there in the dark. I packed up my gear in a hurry, woke my buddy up, and we got out of there. We didn't even make coffee. I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times. The unnatural quiet, the sharp, purposeful snaps, the heavy, slow footsteps with those impossibly long strides, the horrible smell, the feeling of being studied by something I couldn't see. I'll never forget it. I still go camping, it's in my blood. But it's different now. I'm always listening a little harder, watching the tree line a little more closely. I know what's out there, or rather, I know that I don't know. And that's the part that stays with me, that changed everything. I was just a guy by a campfire, and then I wasn't. I was a guy who learned that the woods hold secrets a lot bigger and a lot darker than I ever wanted to know.